Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute for today's event addressing the attendance crisis, new research on chronic absenteeism since the pandemic. I'm Nat Malkus. I'm the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI, and I'm an affiliate of the James Q. Wilson Program and K-12 Education Studies, also here at AEI. Today's event is going to include new research presentations on post-pandemic chronic absenteeism that flow out of AEI's Chronic Absenteeism Research Working Group, affectionately called CARWIG, which we first met in September of last year. And before we get into the research, which I'm excited to see, I want to lay out a little bit of the how and the why behind CARWIG and offer some thanks for those who made it possible. First, why the focus on chronic absenteeism? You're here, so you probably have some inkling of what I'm going to say, but I think it's useful to put out a little context. Chronic absenteeism, of course, is the percentage of students missing at least 10% of the school year. It was a challenge pre-pandemic. It is an even larger challenge post-pandemic. And the data I'm about to show you comes from AEI's Return to Learn tracker, which gathered data on a bunch of pandemic-related issues, school districts across the country, closures and mask mandates, enrollments, and so forth, and switched to chronic absenteeism around 2022 when we realized this was going to be a major aspect of pandemic fallout. So here we see in 2018, that's about 14,000 school districts or so. And in 2018 and 2019, again, chronic absenteeism was a problem. You're not going to see much change when we move to 2019. It's within 0.1%, about 15% of students were chronically absent. That's 1 in 7 K-12 students across the country. We're going to skip 2020 and 2021. Those were the pandemic years. The data is a little questionable, but by 2022, you can see the damage. It got much worse. Red is bad on this map. You want to be not red. In 2022, the data that we have indicates 0.5%, rounds down to 28, of students, so more than 1 in 4 were chronically absent, an increase of almost 90%. In 2023, things got a little better. Directionally, but not a huge amount. And in 2024, this data is going to be coming out in a paper in hopefully next week, maybe the next one if we can get the I's dotted and T's crossed. In 2024, the rate was 23.5%. This is what the national picture looks like. So again, we had a fairly stable rate in 2018-19, a huge jump. And then it's coming down in these post-pandemic years, sort of 2023 being the first really post-pandemic year, 2024, of course, following that. I see these drops of 3% and 2% in a year as, you could see them as that glass half full, glass half empty. The 3-point drop after 2022 is good progress. However, in 2022, we had Omicron, the highest rate of COVID cases ever. And in 2024, we had this slowing rate of decline. So one aspect of this is how chronic absenteeism affects different populations. So I'm just going to look at district types here. And I want to illustrate 2 ideas at the same time that I think is important to understand. We have, there's about 14.5 million kids in each of these buckets in 2019 in gray, 2022 in the orangish, and 2024 in red. And what we see is pre-pandemic, students in low-achieving districts had relatively higher chronic absenteeism, and we see that happened again, that same pattern in 2022 and 2024. So disadvantaged students are affected. They are chronically absent more often, full stop. However, the nature of the change is more even than that. If you look at the proportional difference, how much off the baseline the rise was and the decline was, you see that those in low-achieving districts, they increased about 75%. In high-achieving districts, they increased about 95%, give or take, and have dropped a little bit. You can see the same sort of proportional increases and decreases by achievement, by student poverty, or by minority percentage. The point here is that chronic absenteeism affects disadvantaged students more often, but the rise in chronic absenteeism was an unfortunate tide where all boats rose. So when I look at this curve, I have a question that keeps me up at night. And that question is, what's the new normal going to be? And talking with Todd Rogers, who's a professor at Harvard, who's done some work on chronic absenteeism for some time, he brought up Kurt Lewin's theory of organizational change, where organizations can unfreeze their sort of stable habits, change, and then refreeze. And I kind of see this trajectory as an illustration of that. We had sort of a relatively stable track pre-pandemic, around 15%. Again, that's not good, but it was stable. And then we had this period of change. I know when it happened. It happened in mid-March 2020. And we've had change with the increase. And also we're still in that zone of change, I think, where there is a decrease that we're seeing. The question is, where will that trajectory flatten out? And 23.5%, I certainly hope, is not the end. But the question is how far we can get that down. I think that it takes urgency to get at this, because I think that the longer we wait to act and the longer chronic absenteeism can become somewhat normalized, the more dangerous a long-term threat it is. Last spring and summer, I was doing a lot of work trying to push states, trying to push state leaders, district leaders to set goals and really push on this problem, which I was arguing then and would still argue is one of, if not the most important issues facing public schools. But I got to admit, I felt a little sort of nagging problem, and that is I felt like, well, we're kind of fighting 2024 chronic absenteeism with a 2018 playbook, right? The research takes time. It just does. It takes time to get the data. It takes time to analyze it and to publish it. But the urgency that I was asking state leaders to act with was something that I thought needed to be supplemented about. What do we know about chronic absenteeism that we're seeing today? It's elevated. A lot more students are seeing it. Is it different? Is it a different phenomenon? These are the questions that I wanted to chase, and that is the genesis behind this working group that we put together. The working group is basically in 3 steps, and I want to talk briefly about those steps because they entail 3 groups of folks to thank. The first thing was to get some data that we could use, and we wanted broad data. So we went to states that had high quality attendance data at the student level, so not at the school level, or maybe even the student day level, so we could sort of get further and further under the hood. And the states were very responsive. Today we're going to see data were made available from Indiana, Rhode Island, Virginia, North Carolina, Connecticut, and subsequently we were able to fold in some data from Maryland, Texas, and California. So a broad set of states. More since have offered to do additional work. So I'm really thankful for those state partners. I think state and federal data on education that is high quality is important. I want more of it available. And so I really appreciate the effort of these state leaders that reflects their urgency. The second step was to get some folks who would analyze the data. We put out a call to a bunch of professors and some researchers who had done this work before, that knew their way around the block. And they, too, overwhelmingly were willing to pitch in. They showed up for a meeting in September on pretty short notice. Put our heads together to see what are the low-hanging fruit that we can do with the data at hand. There's lots of questions that take a long time. We were looking for the ones where we could wring out the most information quickly enough to have an impact, hopefully, on the next school year. So we met in September, got some good ideas together, had a great discussion, and I think a good time. And we put together some projects. We have 9 papers today. 8 of those were a direct result of the Carwig project, and we have more that are ongoing that will come out. The goal there was the third part of this, which is to get the data sharing agreements in place and get this done before the school year was out. And we were able to do that. So we have 8 of those projects, more coming. The papers are going to be forthcoming over the next couple of months. And we'll certainly have those publicized, but we get a first look at the results at a time when I still say this school year is still going on, even if in some places in the country it's not. So I have a lot of appreciation for all the efforts that went into that. So a little bit of housekeeping of what to expect today. We're going to have 3 panels, so buckle up. In each of the 3 panels, we're going to have 3 papers, and they'll go through those papers quickly, kind of hitting the high points in about 10 minutes each. Then we'll have an extended period of Q&A where our 3 chairs will ask some questions. We'll also have an opportunity for audience Q&A. The audience here, the audience on live stream, the audience on C-SPAN. You're all welcome to participate, but for those who are not actually here present, if you want to ask a question, you can email those questions, and we're going to get this twice, so catch it now, at christopher.robinson@aei.org. That's christopher.robinson@aei.org, or on Twitter, X, with the hashtag AEI chronic absenteeism. We'll have a break between sessions and some light refreshments out in the hall. A couple of, again, additional thanks. I want to thank Greg Fournier, Christopher Robinson, and my data analyst and co-author Sam Holland for their work on this, making the internal AEI things work. The Carwig researchers that participated, including those who are going to present up here today. And the state leaders that made the data come in. I'd like to thank the James Q. Wilson Center at AEI, program at AEI for their support, and the Arnold Foundation for support in making this possible. And lastly, and just before I let them take the stage, our 3 chairs. So our first session today is going to be on the question, where does chronic absenteeism stand today? And it will be chaired by Ajit Gopalakrishna. He's the Chief Performance Officer at the Connecticut State Department of Education. He oversees data collection, student assessment, research, and I'm sure much more. Ajit served previously for 15 years in the fields of adult education and literacy, managing initiatives on content standards, accountability, assessments, and he was also the GED administrator for the state. I'm going to ask in a moment that Ajit and our other chairs, when they come up here, that they introduce the presenters so you can kind of keep track of names and faces. Our second session centers on the question, why are students chronically absent? And our chair is Liz Cohen. Liz is the Vice President of Policy at 50CAN. That's the 50 State Campaign for Achievement Now. It's a national nonprofit that advocates for high-quality education across the country. Recently, Liz changed. She was the policy director at Future Ed, and Liz has done a bunch of work on K-12 education, including on tutoring, school choice, and chronic absenteeism. The last session of the day focuses on the question, what are the consequences of chronic absenteeism today? And the chair there is Catherine Falconer. Catherine's a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, and a Harkness Fellow in Health Policy and Practice with the Commonwealth Fund. Her research focuses on addressing chronic absenteeism in schools as a public health issue. She's also the Deputy Director of Health Equity and Inclusion at the UK Health Security Agency, where she leads a team focusing on health education and childcare for high-risk groups. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ajit and the first 3 panelists. You can come on up and take the stage. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Nat. Appreciate that warm introduction. As Nat mentioned, Ajit Gopalakrishnan, I'm the Chief Performance Officer at the Connecticut State Department of Education. Connecticut has a long history of focusing on attendance and chronic absence. We've been tracking it since 2012, really, and reporting it and having it part of accountability since 2015. So I really applaud Nat and his leadership for focusing on attendance, because attendance really is the prerequisite for learning. So if kids aren't there, learning becomes that much more challenging. And we know that attendance has worsened during the pandemic and not returned to pre-pandemic levels. There's a lot we can learn by going under the hood. And that's what this first session is really designed to do, by going deeper into the patterns of attendance and absenteeism. And there are three presenters here, and I'll introduce them momentarily. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. I know you could go on for a long time, but 10 minutes to just give a high-level summary, and then we'll go into a panel discussion, and there will be a chance for people to ask questions as well. So please think about what questions you might want to ask. So first we'll hear from Jacob Kersey, who's the Associate Professor of Education at Texas Tech. He will present his findings using data from North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia on the underlying distribution of absences. Typically we tend to look at the binary measure or average measures, but obviously there are distributions underneath them. So he'll share a distributional look and how that has changed over the years. Then we'll move to a team from Wayne State, represented by Jeremy Singer here, Associate Director of the Detroit Partnership for Education Equity and Research, who, along with the team that includes Sarah Lenhoff, who's the Leonard Kaplan Endowed Professor, along with Nat and Sam from AEI, who will share their research using data from Rhode Island on day-level absences and what those patterns tell us about the nature of absenteeism. And last, we'll hear from Morgan Polikoff, who's a professor of education at the University of Southern California, and his doctoral student, who is not here, but who was part of the work, Nicholas Pardo, who will share their work using data from North Carolina and Virginia on the predictors of chronic absenteeism and how those have changed pre to post-COVID. So let's welcome Dr. Jacob Kersey from Texas Tech.
All right, thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak to you a little bit about the distribution in absenteeism. My talk is titled, How Has This Changed Over Time? So just brief history, my first project in graduate school was to look at student absenteeism with Dr. Michael Gottfried, at the time UC Santa Barbara. So it's really nice to be able to kind of zoom out and start looking at some data, not only from my home state in Texas, but some other states, North Carolina, and Virginia as well. So I don't even have to start with the problem. You know why we're here. We have seen a spike in chronic absenteeism, as Nat so lovely laid out for us at the national level. This has spiked in some states as high as double and higher in some others as well. But what I'm going to spend my time talking to you about today is that common policy metrics like chronic absenteeism or average daily attendance can really skew some under-the-hood dynamics that are worth better understanding as to how we as policymakers or practitioners or interventionists can really think about combating this issue. And a quick example is just to look at this graph on the right, where you see that post-pandemic, Texas saw a 40% increase as of 2023, or 60% increase in chronic absenteeism. But if you shift this to look at average daily absences, you see that statistic changes quite dramatically, down to 40%. Still high, but very different. And the reason that it's different is these two statistics tell us very different things, and I would argue don't give us the complete picture and thus are not sufficient for us to understand the dynamics of absenteeism that we're seeing today. So some motivating questions is just how many students are missing school now is not enough. Have we seen just our good attenders having a bit fewer absences now? Are we seeing that some of our more concerning students who are exhibiting high absences before are even more extreme, or has just everyone become more absent? And the reason that we ask these questions is because we want to better understand not just how many more students are chronically absent, we also want to understand how educational dynamics and absences dynamics have really changed as a result of the pandemic. So a quick example, or some examples I'm going to point to today, my colleagues are going to look at some other states, but I'm going to focus on data coming from Texas, Virginia, and North Carolina. I'm simply going to look at aggregate levels of absences. With Texas, I get a little bit more in depth looking at some 6-week periods, but otherwise, we're looking at just annual absence rates for students and some differences in demographic trends that we've seen. So, what have we seen in terms of how absences have shifted looking at data from 2017 to 2023? we've seen that overall, all students are more absent on average, not just our high attenders from before, not just our more extreme problematic previous attendees, but everyone. But what I want to highlight for you is it's actually a bit more of a complicated story. Not have we overall seen a rightward shift in the amount of overall absences in these 3 states, we have seen a bit more of a skew, meaning that we are seeing higher amounts and proportions of students who are exhibiting more extreme rates of absences. This is mirrored across all 3 states, but I'm going to point to the distribution for Virginia specifically. What you can see here, the red line represents our kind of, sketchier data years immediately following the pandemic, 2020, 2021. So I want to draw your attention to the blue line, which represents absences back 2017 through 2019, and compare it to the green line, which is looking at absences 2022, 2023. And what I first want you to notice is that over there on the left in A, we're seeing that blue line is a lot higher than the green line, which simply tells us that we're seeing fewer students with better attendance rates. But if you look over there on the left, or on the right, we see over at B that we have that green line then exceeding the blue line overall, which suggests that there are greater proportions of students who are missing school. But again, the green curve overall still shifts there to the right, which suggests that across the absenteeism distribution, we're seeing that on average, all students are more likely to miss school. Now, pulling the data from the 3 states together, I want to show you something that I found particularly interesting. I started this Sankey chart, I love a good Sankey chart, because I wanted to see just for the same groups of students who have attended school both right before the pandemic hit and right after, how were their absenteeism patterns shifting? Kind of getting at that questions I was asking earlier around, have absenteeism patterns shifted just for our better attenders, our lower attenders? Overall, this is just looking at snapshots between 2019 and 2023. What I first want to draw your attention to is that 0 to 4% group. That made up over 50% of students attending schools in these 3 states, meaning that there are about 50% of students with pretty good attendance rates in 2019. About a moderate amount represented by the orange, and then about 10% of students are missing, or 17% of students are missing about 10% or more of the school year. As you can see over there on 2023, that blue bar shifts quite significantly, suggesting, again, that we've seen some of those better attenders now have lower attendance rates. But getting to my point earlier, these are snapshots, and then I thought, okay, for a Sankey chart, I'm going to have to go adjust these bars, adjust some of my graph code, but actually the distribution stayed roughly the same. And so now what I want to show you is the value of being able to follow students longitudinally from those, again, attending school right before the pandemic and right after. Prior to the pandemic, we saw that about 73% of students who were chronically absent then were also chronically absent in 2023. That makes sense. But what you'll notice is that those students only make up a proportion of the students who are now chronically absent in 2023. They make up just a fraction. We see that big chunks of students who were in that well-attending distribution and big chunks of students who were more moderately absent from school are now feeding into these more extreme absence levels. And even students who were in that kind of good attendance range, we've now seen fall in the more moderate absence group. And this is interesting because, again, that distribution changed even though we're losing some students in some grade levels. And so, yeah, absenteeism has changed just about all across the distribution. But what this ultimately means, whether you're looking at it for these groups of students longitudinally or overall, that we've gone from 50% of students in these 3 states who had some pretty good attendance rates to 30%. We have about the same percentage of students who are exhibiting moderate absenteeism rates, but they're made up of some of who we would expect to have better attendance rates prior to the pandemic. And we have increased the bucket of students who we would consider chronically absent or just exhibiting higher rates of absenteeism, going from about 17% prior to 37% now in these 3 states. But of course, these changes were driven not just across the board demographically. There were some demographic trends that are worth highlighting. Showing you some data from North Carolina, we see that the change in attendance rates prior to the pandemic to now were driven through differences across both race and ethnic lines, but also through some of students receiving some special services from schools or more historically marginalized demographics. One in particular I'll draw your attention to across all 3 states is that students who were experiencing homelessness saw the biggest shift in the amount of days that they were missing school prior to the pandemic. And these same patterns are reflected also in Texas and Virginia. And then perfectly to tee up Jeremy Singer in his next talk, I was able to look at, in Texas data, some shift in absence trajectories for the year. So meaning not just each year, but also within a year, both prior to the pandemic and now. So what this graph shows you is just the 6 weeks periods across the x-axis and then the daily absence rate. And what you'll notice is in the pre-pandemic, the blue line, we see a pretty steady increase in what we know from absenteeism research, which is that absences tend to increase daily as you go through the school year. But what was interesting is we actually see that absences spike in the fall, in the 2nd and 3rd 6-week period, in Texas at least, suggesting that students could be struggling to reacclimate or became more engaged in school at the very beginning, which I think draws some important attention when we start to think about interventions and policies and how we think about overall absenteeism for students in schools. So, what does this mean? It means that absences are both more common for everybody, but they are also more extreme. We're seeing that not only are we seeing more students crossing that 10% chronic absenteeism threshold, but more students overall are shifting to more extreme levels. There's also signs that there may be greater absences within the beginning of the school year. We see that chronic absenteeism really is no longer the concentrated piece. We can look at differences in the patterns across all rates of absences. We see overall fewer students are exhibiting strong attendance. In particular, you recall the big shift in our previous good attender buckets down to the moderate and chronic absence levels. And then we knew this probably before the data, but some of our more historically marginalized groups are some of the ones who have unfortunately experienced the biggest shifts in missing the most school. So thank you very much. I'm excited to engage some of the discussion and follow-up.
Thank you, Dr. Kersey. Next up will be Dr. Singer from Wayne State, who will share day-level absence patterns and what that tells us using data from Rhode Island. Dr. Singer.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Jeremy Singer from Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. I'm here representing myself, my colleague Sarah Lenhoff. Together, we wrote a book called Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, where we discussed some of the insights from our prior research on the topic. And of course, Nat and Sam from AEI, who the 4 of us worked together on the following presentation and paper on day-level patterns in attendance and absenteeism. So we set out to answer 2 questions. Number 1, what can we learn when we look at attendance day to day to day over the course of a school year and also over the course of many school years pre to post pandemic? And in particular, whether these day level patterns of attendance have changed from pre to post pandemic. To do that, we were able to work with day level student attendance data from the state of Rhode Island. And you can see reflected on the chart here, Rhode Island's attendance patterns look something like the rest of the nation, where we saw a spike coming out of through the COVID-19 pandemic and some recovery, though not to where we were at in pre-pandemic levels. And to frame the conversation here, we wanted to note, I guess, 2 things. The first is that we had an initial interest in patterns in attendance because, like Jacob mentioned, when we think about the specific patterns that you observe over the course of a year, that can really inform school leaders and district leaders and policymakers for orienting their interventions or the way that they allocate resources to try and support students. They might also reveal some insights on what has changed for students over the course of the pandemic We've heard a lot of theories or stories about why students are missing more school. This presentation doesn't answer any of those questions, but the idea is that the patterns might lend or provide a little bit of insight to sort of orient or direct our thinking as we dig deeper into that question. And so what I'm going to quickly go through is 4 different day-level attendance patterns that we wanted to hone in on based on the data. The first, which Jacob teed up perfectly, is seasonal absenteeism patterns. And what you're looking at here is a graph of attendance month to month in Rhode Island for every school year from 2016-17 through the most recent, from 23-24 is our most recent year. So 2015-16, I'm sorry, is the earliest school year. I apologize. So we've got a lot of years of data. And you can see that cluster of blue and gray lines at the bottom represents these pre-pandemic school years. So you can see a relatively consistent seasonal pattern. Again, like Jacob mentioned, slow increase over time in absences. And you can see a relatively similar pattern in the post-pandemic period as well, with the exception of during the years when COVID rates were particularly high, strong spikes in the periods where COVID spikes happened. So looking at December and January in particular around Delta and Omicron waves. Otherwise, what we're concluding is that on the whole, absence patterns tend to look relatively similar seasonally from pre to post-pandemic, except at an elevated level because there are higher levels of absences overall. Second pattern that we looked at was looking at absences by day of the week. So this is probably not a surprise to anyone, but we found that absences were a little bit more likely on Mondays and Fridays. So we're sort of talking about this as a weekend effect. We also tried to explore some absences around holidays and other planned closures. And I don't want to say too much more about that because we're still working on that analysis, but we find something similar where there tends to be more absences around those days off from school. And so you can see the patterns pre-pandemic in this slide. And here's what it looked like in a snapshot of a post-pandemic school year. And so you can see there does look like there's a bit of an increased level of absences on Mondays or Fridays relative to the other days of the week. But on the whole, the distribution across day of the week is pretty similar to what it looked like pre-pandemic. So we're not seeing a drastic spike in the amount of absenteeism concentrated on, say, Fridays or Mondays. The third thing we looked at were streaks of absences. And so in other words, as you can see in the chart here, the very first bar represents one-day absences. So say a student is here today, misses the next day, is back in school the day after. And just like before the pandemic, this is from the most recent school year, 23-24, just like before the pandemic, the at least plurality in this case of absences are from single-day absences. But there's also times where students, as you can see, will miss 2 days in a row, or 3 days, or 4 days, or 5, or even more than 5 days. And so we wanted to investigate a little bit more closely how this streaks versus single-day absences looked over time. What you can see is that, especially in the sort of height of the pandemic, single-day absences as a share of the total number of absences happening dropped substantially, and that was replaced, or where we saw a greater increase in the distribution was for these very long absences, so 5 or more, or greater than 5 days of absences. And we think that this pretty clearly reflects the public health conditions at the time, so both the actual rates of illness and infection from COVID-19 and also potentially public health measures that were in place, things like quarantining policies. And so you can see that as we sort of exit that height of the pandemic, the streaks start to subside and we start to return to near pre-pandemic levels of single-day absences. If you look closely, you'll notice that we do look like we have slightly elevated levels of 2-day absences and slightly higher levels of 1-day absences. And Sam actually ran some simulations, and what we concluded from this is this has a lot to do with just the fact that there are more absences in general. So I wouldn't read too much into where we're at right now. We basically concluded that we're looking at more or less what you would expect at the level of absences that are occurring. And so we're sort of a return to where we were more or less pre-pandemic. The final pattern that we investigated here is what we talk about as acute versus persistent absenteeism. So what we mean by this is for some students, their absences happen in a big clump or maybe a few spikes throughout the year, but otherwise they have pretty great attendance. That's represented by the graph you can see on the left side. So you can see these two example students, one blue and one red, had sharp spikes in absences. They missed a lot of school, one of them in September, another one in December. That could represent some sort of life change or illness or something like that. But then you can see for the rest of the school year, in each month, they didn't miss that much school. So that's an example of what one student's attendance patterns might look like. On the other hand, you have what we would call persistent absences. So on the right side, you can see two more examples. And you have students who their attendance rates look relatively similar from month to month. So maybe they're missing an extra day here or there from month to month, but on average, they're missing a similar amount of school. All of the example students on this slide have missed the same amount of school. They're all examples of students, real students in Rhode Island, who missed 15 days of school in this school year. So you can see that the actual patterns for students over the course of the year can look different. Some have more acute, some have more persistent patterns of absenteeism. We looked at whether this acute versus persistent absenteeism changed over time. And what we found is resonant with a lot of what we've already talked about in this presentation, which is during the height of the pandemic, we saw some change and then a sort of return to the baseline over time. In particular, we saw that absences became more acute, and we think that aligns pretty clearly with the story that we were seeing earlier of spikes around what we would assume to be related to public health circumstances and measures. So in other words, we started by thinking about, can we get some insight into the various explanations for why attendance rates are lower and absenteeism is higher since the pandemic, and why is that persisting? And what we've concluded is that the patterns show, yes, some substantial differences, especially at the height of the pandemic, but now relatively similar patterns to what we were seeing before the pandemic. So absence rates remain higher, absence rates remain higher, absenteeism remains higher, attendance rates remain lower, but the patterns from day to day over the course of the school year look remarkably similar to what we were seeing in the pre-pandemic period. So we're continuing to dig for answers to understand, but we're hoping that this at least gives some insight into what the shape and the dynamics of absenteeism look like today and help policymakers and school leaders respond.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. Lastly, Dr. Morgan Polikoff from USC on the predictors of chronic absence and how they've changed using data from North Carolina and Virginia.
All right, thank you. It's very nice to be here. I'm presenting on behalf of my student, Nick Pardo, who has a very good excuse for not being here, which is he's getting married today. So I will allow his absence. So Jacob had a really nice slide where he showed demographic differences in absenteeism in North Carolina, and I'm going to basically take that slide and make it 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you about demographic differences in two of the states that he showed, but I'm going to really dive in deep. So we look at absenteeism rates and how they vary across student demographic groups and years. Which student and school characteristics are most strongly predictive of student absenteeism? And I'm not actually going to present data on school characteristics because we don't find super strong school level relationships. It's mostly driven by students themselves. To what extent have the demographic predictors changed? So looking at some of those things again that Jacob was showing, and how sensitive are the results to the chosen measure of absenteeism? So most of what I'm going to present is using a measure of chronic absenteeism, but then at the very end I'll talk about percent of days absent. We use data from Virginia and North Carolina as well, and the years that are shown here and the demographics that are shown there. We have homeless and migrant in North Carolina, but not in Virginia included in this analysis, and you'll see that those two groups do tend to show up as different from other groups. We do some very simple descriptive analyses for the first research question, and then we run some regressions. Basically, we dump all these demographic variables in a model, and we say, okay, well, which ones are significant predictors of chronic absenteeism, controlling for the other variables in the model. And we do this separately pre and post-COVID, and then compare the coefficients to say, well, has the magnitude of the difference, say, between low-income students and non-low-income students changed from pre to post-COVID? So those are our analyses, and at the end, as I said, I'll also talk about the percent of days attended dependent variable. So I'm going to jump into results. I'm going to present a lot of different results here and tell you sort of the story of what we observed in the data. So first, we see that chronic absenteeism rates are up sharply in both states and have not fully recovered to pre-COVID levels. There's nothing new here because we've already heard that 3 different times. There is substantial variation across student groups and current chronic absenteeism rates. So this is Virginia. You might not be able to see the labels of the individual groups, but on the left side of the graph there, you can see the groups with the lowest chronic absenteeism rates are gifted students, Asian students, students in later elementary grades like 2, 3, 4, and 5, and white students. So those groups have the lowest chronic absence rates. And on the right side, you can see the groups that have the highest chronic absence rates. And those are mobile students, foster youth, low-income students, 12th graders who have substantially more absences than other grades, students with disabilities. So this is the graph for Virginia. This is the graph for North Carolina, and without going into detail, I can tell you the order is almost exactly the same. So the demographic groups are very, very similar across the states in terms of their rates of chronic absenteeism. We also see homeless, as I mentioned earlier, as the top group there in terms of chronic absenteeism in North Carolina. So we see very consistent patterns between the states. When you calculate the chronic absence rates pre-COVID and post-COVID, and then just take the difference. So that just tells you how much chronic absenteeism has increased in percentage point terms. That's what this graph shows, and this is for Virginia. And so what you can see is that for the most part, more disadvantaged groups mostly had larger increases in percentage point terms in chronic absenteeism. So on the right side, you can see the groups that had the largest increases in chronic absenteeism in Virginia are English learners and Hispanic students, mobile students, low-income students, foster youth, and black students. On the left side, you can see the groups that had smaller percentage point increases are gifted students and white students and Asian students as well. But interestingly, and this kind of goes back to what Nat said at the beginning, to some extent the opposite is true if instead of taking the difference between the chronic absence rates, you take the ratio. So you sort of consider where the groups started and then you consider where the groups ended. And so if you now are looking at percent increases in chronic absenteeism, so relative to pre-COVID rates, you see that some of the groups that had the lowest chronic absence rates pre-COVID actually had the largest increase. So for instance, Asian students had the largest increase in percent terms. Now in percentage point terms, they still had quite low increase, but that's an interesting contrast. And we went back and forth with AEI about whether to focus on one or the other. I like percentage point. I think Nat and Sam preferred percent. And anyway, so it's my paper, so I'm going to mostly talk about percentage points. So when we put all these things in a regression model and we say, okay, well, which are the groups that are significantly different from other groups in terms of chronic absenteeism post-COVID, what we see is mobile students are the largest coefficient there, so they're 18 percentage points more likely to be chronically absent than non-mobile students. Low-income students, 12 percentage points more likely than non-low-income students. 12th graders, 4 to 14 percentage points more likely, depending on the comparison grade. So it's like 12th and 11th graders and kindergartners have high absence rates, and all the grades in the middle have lower. Gifted students are less likely by 7 percentage points than non-gifted students, and students with disabilities are 5 points more likely to be chronically absent. In Virginia, English learner racial gaps are generally quite small once you control for these other variables, once you control for income and other things that I've mentioned. In North Carolina, the patterns are very similar, but the magnitudes are a little bit larger. So homeless students and low-income students and mobile students more than 10 percentage points more likely. Gifted students and foster students somewhat less likely. The foster student one is, I think, the only coefficient in any of the regressions that's interesting, meaning that it's the opposite of what you might expect. And I don't know, I don't study foster students that much, but I'm sure you could probably come up with an explanation about what kinds of families those students are placed in. And the racial gaps are slightly larger in North Carolina than in Virginia. So then, as I mentioned, what we do is we look at the magnitude of these coefficients from pre to post, and we say, okay, well, have the gaps gotten wider? And by and large, the answer to that question is yes. the gaps have gotten wider or things have tended in kind of a worse direction. Looking, for instance, at the right graph there, you can see that the gap between low-income and non-low-income students increased from pre-COVID, the blue bar, to post-COVID, the red bar, and the little star tells you that that's a significant increase. And similarly, the gifted coefficient was negative before, and it became more negative. Gifted students are even less likely to be chronically absent post-COVID. And the patterns are very similar in North Carolina as well. I'll just leave this slide up for one sec. And then I'll summarize, looking across those two states. In both states, the low-income and non-low-income gap widened significantly. In both states, the gifted, non-gifted gap widened significantly. In most racial groups, coefficients became more positive, meaning that they are more likely to be chronically absent relative to white students and relative to Asian students. And those changes were almost always significant. And just looking at levels, post-COVID, low-income students, mobile students, and homeless students remain by far the most absent subgroups. There's a lot of words on this slide. If instead we do the logistic regression thing that Sam and Nat wanted me to do and consider the relative increases, the story actually is interestingly different, and I encourage you to take a look at the paper once that becomes public. But so for instance, like black students typically had lower odds of chronic absenteeism than white students, controlling for income and other things, pre-COVID, and they have still lower but closer to even odds post-COVID. That's just one example of what's these differences. If instead we use the percent of days absent outcome instead of chronically absent indicators, the story is basically the same. So the answer to the question is yes. Some interesting facts. Percent of daily absence increased from about 5 to 7% in Virginia and about 5.5 to 8% in North Carolina. In percentage point terms, the increases were highest for foster, Hispanic, EL, and mobile students in Virginia, and mobile and homeless students in North Carolina. And the same group showed up in the regressions as being the most different: mobile students, low-income students, homeless students, and 12th graders. So overall, absenteeism is up. It's up for all groups across the board. I think that's a very consistent finding among our papers. When looking in absolute terms, the most disadvantaged groups are typically more likely to have seen larger increases in chronic absenteeism. So low-income and mobile or homeless students especially had large increases. Racial gaps are not overly large, controlling for income and other things in the model, but in both states, regression-adjusted racial gaps have tended in the wrong direction, meaning that underrepresented minority students are seeing attendance getting worse relative to white and Asian students. And the patterns are broadly very similar between the states, but the level of the problem seems, at least in these data as we analyzed it, although I noticed it was different from the percentages on Jacob's graphs, a tiny bit worse in North Carolina. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This is, you've given us a lot to chew on in 30 minutes here. But I'd say that overall it seems that absenteeism is getting worse across the board. Any patterns or any disruptions in traditional or sort of historical patterns that occurred during the pandemic seem to have reverted back to pre-pandemic patterns, if you will. And when looking at predictors, it seems like, while there's overall increase, the past predictors of historical underperformance, under-engagement, just seem to have become more pronounced through the pandemic or after the pandemic. So I guess just to get the ball rolling here, what surprised you in your findings here? Like, was there anything in your findings that actually sort of said, that's different, that's not what I expected, and so what surprised you here? And anybody can take that.
I mean, I'll start. I didn't expect to see the shift as much as I saw the shift. And again, I think some of the difference is I just was looking kind of like raw descriptive statistics. But I mean, looking at those high attenders from before, there's a big chunk who are now in that moderate rate, which like you could argue, I know we have papers later on that are going to talk more about like what does absenteeism mean in terms of what it predicts, but it is a pretty significant shift to think about across these 3 states that there was such a big chunk of students who were pretty good attenders before, both in snapshots and longitudinally, who are more absent now. And so the implications there, I think, then inspire a lot more papers that you're going to hear about earlier.
I'll just say, I don't know that any of the patterns that we looked at alone were surprising, but when you put them all together, just the fact that the patterns of attendance across the school year do look so similar pre to post, that there was like no substantial differences, that taken as a whole was pretty surprising to me. Still trying to think through what exactly that implies for how we make sense of the problem, but at minimum, I think it at least helps provide some suggestive evidence that some of the pet theories that folks have about what might explain these changes, at least on average, don't necessarily hold up because they're not reflected in some of the patterns from day to day or from week to week over the school year.
And what might be the pet theories you're thinking of, just if you don't mind?
Well, so I'll try and think, like one that was on the slide, for example, is seeing more common students just taking vacations during the year or skipping school more often to extend their weekends. Again, we don't necessarily see those as like the major patterns that are reflected. It doesn't invalidate broader shifts that I think it lends credence to the fact that there's broader disruptions or challenges that students and families are facing or that they're experiencing in school that might explain why the overall trajectory of the patterns look the same, even if the sort of level of absences have slightly increased over time. Yeah.
I just think that the income gap really was the main driver that showed up over and over again, and that swamped the racial differences. I think also, that income indicator, of course, is super crude, and I think if we had a more detailed measure of students' income, I'm sure we would see all along the distribution that more disadvantaged kids would be the ones missing school more. We just don't have the data for that. Although we do have a hint of that because, for instance, homeless students are by far the most likely to be chronically absent. So that's another thing I wouldn't say was surprising, but the fact that student level income is a main driver here seems to be really important.
Oh, thank you. And I know the data that you're working with is attendance, whether it be daily, monthly data. It doesn't necessarily tell you what's going on underneath, why are students absent? So the next question, I'll sort of keep it at the data level, which is, given what you've done, what you've seen with the data, what advice would you give a district or a school leader, or even an SEA at a state level, in terms of how they should think about tracking and monitoring data? And what are a few things you would suggest to an SEA or a school or district in terms of how they should look at their own data so as to actually make an impact during the year and not just do postmortems?
If I can start, if you don't mind. I mean, the first is pretty consistent evidence over time that students who belong to certain subgroups are more often chronically absent. One thing that we didn't talk about too is just students' prior chronic absence status. But so if you're a school leader and you're here in May and June, and you're thinking about what am I going to be doing for next year, start with a list of who your chronically absent students were already this year, who your students who switched schools this year were, who your homeless students or low-income students, and start to think of a plan to support those students now. You don't need to wait to find out that they're missing school next year. You can anticipate that a lot of them might have challenges. The other thing is, we did want to mention that, especially I think that acute versus persistent absence pattern is a really helpful one for practitioners as they're supporting students to think about where and how to allocate resources. So if students have like a streak of absences, they should receive a lot of attention right away. But if a student missed a ton of school last month and missed basically no school this month, it might be an indicator that they had a one-time issue and they should try and find out what that was to make sure. But whereas students who have more persistent absences over the school year might need more attention because there's some sustained issue that isn't being addressed, that is continuing to cause them to miss that amount of school. So I think those are some of the insights from there's more for sure in this patterns over the school year when it comes to seasonality and day of the week. Schools might be thinking strategically about that. But
I think, collect and use better data, sort of big D data and small d data, right? So try and understand try and systematically understand the reasons why kids are, I don't know whether that's, if the kid is out, you just ask the parent, which of these 5 things is it? And try and track that and use that to inform. Because really there's a big difference between the kid has an illness and is chronically sick versus the kid is super disengaged and doesn't want to show up. And I think also small d data, which is, have teachers reach out or have school counselors reach out to kids and try and understand, for this particular child, what is the factor? Because your response is going to be quite different if you have one reason for absence versus another. And I'll just say, another project that we're doing is we're interviewing families and also teenagers about why they're absent, and learning really tremendous things about, I think, the high levels of disengagement and also illness that seem to be major factors that I would guess those are the 2 main factors that are really driving these increases.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with more work that I've done with our research practice partners in West Texas, and then I'll connect that to the data that I think we've seen today. So what I have seen in my experience is that more people within the school system are talking to each other about absences. So we have absenteeism being talked about in central offices more. We have central office talking to principals more about absenteeism data, principals talking to teachers more. And so I think connecting that to the data we've seen on the demographic differences in the extremes that we've seen in how much more certain marginalized groups are to be chronically absent or absent more generally post-pandemic, I think it then raises the urgency for these conversations to then talk about and not discount experiences from these groups. So one example is we work with one school district that now is actually talking about transportation for the first time. Like, one of the anecdotes they bring up is a family has said, hey, we live across, really close to the school, so we don't qualify for the bus route that you offer, but we live across a major street. And so I'm sorry, I don't feel like, when I can't take my kid to school, that I'm going to let that kid, go by themselves, or it's understandable that the kids don't want to cross this major street with huge speeds and all that good stuff. So I think it just connects some of those experiences that we're hearing about with more conversations around absenteeism to then, okay, let's talk about it more and let's triangulate more of what's happening, because that's the only way we're going to get to solutions.
Yeah, I think this notion of the seasonal attendance that you brought up, Dr. Singer, in your paper, I was intrigued by that. And you said just a moment ago that you were thinking that maybe it was not related to holidays or vacations as much. Did I miss that, or?
Well, just that we didn't see, for example, we didn't see that like acute absences were more likely since the pandemic. So there aren't like sudden spikes in, random instances of taking 3 or 4 or 5 days off or something like that. At least it doesn't seem that way.
Okay, great. Appreciate that clarification. Let me poke into grade levels a little bit, because I don't know if all of your papers necessarily got into grade levels, but I know, Morgan, in your work, grade 12 came up, and we've all heard of senioritis and what that entails. But I was just curious, and anyone can start off. In your work, did you notice any sort of patterns? And I was curious on the daily attendance front too. Are the patterns for daily attendance different in any way across grades? And because why students might miss school and who is the driving force behind the student getting to school are different across those grades. So I was just curious if you had any further insights to add around grades and the impact of and how absenteeism behaves across the grades.
Yeah, so, and I should have put that graph in the slides, but I didn't. But we also, we looked at those differences by grade level pre and post COVID, and we do find that the grades, I would say kindergarten and 12th grade are those are basically the grades where there was more absences before things got worse, right? And that, I think, is could be a story of disengagement for the 12th graders, probably not a story of disengagement for the kindergartners, but it might be a story of lots of different factors, including transportation and illnesses and things for kindergartners. There's also other things that happen that, sometimes I think schools contribute by, for instance, having like a half-day policy where, on the Fridays they do the half-day for the whatever, and the parents are like, well, I'm not going to send my kid for a half-day. That's a waste of their time. And so there are lots of different factors that I think are contributing, but we did see the pattern of, again, the gaps widening consistently.
You're all renowned researchers. You've done a lot of work in this space. So now I'm going to ask you to maybe, and Morgan, you started to do that, is connect this work that you did to other work that you have done. How does what you learned here align with other research that you might have done or is ongoing? And again, I'm going to ask you to hypothesize a little bit, and what, in terms of like what direction might you give in terms of advice for schools and districts in terms of where to focus energies for tackling this work? Because I know there are next sessions, we'll get into that a little bit, but just given your wealth of knowledge, I just wanted to give you a moment to sort of extend what you've learned here and connect it with some of your other work.
So we had one report that came out, I think, last year that was connecting. So I co-direct a nationally representative survey of American households called the Understanding America Study, and we've been tracking folks since COVID and their educational experiences. And in that study, that report looked at connections between parent-reported absences and parent reports of kids' mental health or well-being using a validated instrument. And we found strong connections between kids who were scoring higher on that mental health scale, meaning they have more concerns about their mental health, and their propensity to be chronically absent. And that finding isn't surprising, but nonetheless, I think did validate some of the theories that people have to some extent, and we're taking that, and as I just said, we're now moving on to continue to study. We just got a new grant to study chronic absenteeism by surveying parents and kids. Now we're going to be surveying teenagers in those households for the first time, and we're also interviewing both parents and kids from our sample about the reasons for it. And let me tell you, reading these transcripts of the kids and parents who've been selected because they're highly chronically absent is really difficult. A lot of these kids have really severe traumas, lots of very legitimate reasons for missing school, really chronic disengagement. The school is not serving them well, and it's very hard to read through that. So we're trying to understand this, over time and longitudinally, and get some real insights into the reasons.
Jeremy, or
Yeah. So, I think maybe to a bit more positive outlook. I want to think about, there are bright spots that are happening, right? So in some of our work, we find that there are some really effective teachers who are driving down absenteeism among students who statistically we would think are more likely to be absent. So that's just one example of an in-school factor that is within your control of, again, we just looked at it statistically, like we don't have qualitative data from these teachers, although we are collecting it, as to what they are doing that seems to be moving the needle a little bit on these students. But I also think too, like from our experience, school districts sometimes feel isolated, right? And so I think we as researchers, one, what that means is we need to be able to support districts with data, if we have access to statewide data, to look for, okay, are there similar districts that seem to be bright spots that we can look towards around what they could be doing on the ground? Are they hiring teachers with better qualifications, which seems to be the case in Texas? Are we having conversations with principals around why it's important that you don't just unenroll your student to hit the chronic absenteeism metric, or keep them in school to that you hit the graduation metric? Like, are we having the conversations as an ecosystem, which I know, Jeremy, that is a lot of your work. And I just want to point to, I think there are some bright spots, and we just need to actually tap in and learn a lot from them.
I'll just add three things if that's okay. So first, and this is something that actually is really echoed throughout all of our comments, is focus on the reasons that students are missing school, not just the rates at which they're missing school. You can even see in our presentations, we focused on attendance rates and absence rates because that's the easily accessible data. That's also true for schools. It's harder to get to the root causes, but that's going to be the best leverage to help resolve issues that students and their families are having, is actually understanding the drivers, the root causes. So that's one. The second is, I would say, focus on fundamentals. If you're a school or a district, we are doing ongoing work understanding what sort of discrete strategies that schools across the state of Michigan are using. But some of our work in Detroit and elsewhere suggests that you don't necessarily need to focus on new initiatives. You might want to focus more on fundamentally the culture and climate of your school, the strong relationships that you can foster, and those excellent academics and teaching. And just last thing, if you don't mind, is again to echo what Jacob said. Our book is called Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism: Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. So I think the subtitle says it all. We think that it's important to bring in other sectors to this conversation because, especially with higher rates across the nation, the resources and strategies that we need to serve families and their students are, of course, what's in school, but also what's outside of them.
Great, thank you. Now it's time for audience questions. Anybody have a question in the audience? Over there.
Thank you all for your comments. They've been really interesting. Jacob, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your Sankey chart. So I noticed that, obviously things are looking worse, but some students who were struggling before the pandemic have actually improved. I don't think that that's like a causal relationship with the pandemic, but I'm curious, it suggests that there's just like a natural, like sometimes kids become more chronically absent, sometimes less. What's kind of the latent chronic absentee changes that we see? Like, does it move around a lot? Like, can one student be really chronically absent one year and then less the next year? What does that pattern look like outside of COVID?
Yeah, so I'm not sure entirely if I have an answer to your question, but I guess I would point to, it is variable. So if you were to put a Sankey chart just year to year to year to year to year, you would see lines doing, all sorts of things. And so I think it just draws more questions into it, honestly, than it has answers. But, when you throw that together, for example, you see differences for different students in one year to the next. And I think what that suggests is there's going to be some of these structural factors that are just fundamentally going to be different for students at different points in their educational journey. I also think it's important that I didn't do this, or show this, but if you shrink it to just certain grade levels, then you see even more interesting patterns and differences. And so, yeah, I think your question raises more questions I'd love to continue to dig into this data and have more conversations about.
Other questions over there? Oh, sorry.
Oh,
it's hard to see from with the lights in your face.
Yeah, so I think a couple of you talked about how there are things outside of schools that are influencing chronic absenteeism, and I think, so I work in school mental health, so I think mental health in schools is great, but Morgan, you talking about how kids who need the help are also not going to school, and so a lot of times we kind of are putting a lot of our eggs in the school-based mental health basket, for example. But I think some of the other kind of outside of school solutions, I'm just curious what you all have seen in terms of where we're not putting everything upon the schools to fix the problem, but there's partnerships and recognition that it has to be kind of a group effort.
I'd just like to say, you raise a really good point, which is there's sort of a spectrum of you can integrate resources into the school and use the school as an important hub. In some cases, you might actually make schools formally responsible for delivering those things, like a school counselor or a social worker or a school-based mental health service. On the other hand, you might have completely separate initiatives. I think the right answer is probably having some kind of mix, because to your point, you're asking schools to do increasingly more and more and things that are outside of the core focus of instruction. And so some kind of mix of like integrating services and resources while also improving the sort of direct delivery of resources or services to families makes sense. I had something else I wanted to say about that, but if you want, did you want to chime in? Because you had the...
Well, I was going to give a very unsatisfying answer to that question, which is to say another thing that I wanted to say about what schools do that is not maybe not good, but I think is definitely a contributing factor, which is it is just way easier to be absent now and make up for it. So I mentioned in our interview study, we interviewed 40 families, and do you know out of the 40 families how many said it's so easy to make up for being absent? 39 of them. And then we asked, well, would you like to make it not so easy? Like, could we not have Google Classroom? And so then you'd have to, like in my day, you had to like get a packet and do the work at home. And do you know how many of the 40 said, that's a good idea, let's make it harder? 0. So people like that everything's available online and convenient. And then also I think there is absolutely no question in my mind that doing that, which is well-intentioned, and certainly the pandemic made more places do that, makes it much easier for people to be absent and feel like they can make it up.
So just to put a button on what I was saying earlier, I'm sorry to bring it back, but I think you want to be strategic about what changes and improvements to services and things like that can you do outside of schools. I mean, obviously one of the big answers is just greater investment, more resources into some of these things like transportation and health and housing. But in lieu of that, maybe we can reduce some of the administrative barriers, invest more in things like navigators, help people accessing those things.
I would just add, and not to sound like a cynical academic, but I think if you were to show districts a bunch of data like this, they would be overwhelmed and they would just, be paralyzed as to what to do. So I think we like looking at this data a lot, and perhaps at the, state level, I think it's interesting to look at this data. But there is no bigger way that you can make an impact at a school district than to go at their board meeting and present data in a very accessible way, because school board members, if they are invested in their community, are outside of school. They are the ones who can make more structural changes more quickly, about things like changing the bus policy of the school, which affects an out-of-school factor around transportation. So that's what I've learned a lot on the ground, is to, put it on researchers' backs to go outside of our computers and talk to a school board, talk to a superintendent, talk to a principal.
Thank you. One more question. I think the lady over there had her hand up, actually. Thank you.
That's okay. It's more of a comment. So we are the boots on the ground. This is the left boot, and I'm the right boot. So appreciate everything that we saw. We're like bobbleheads. Yes, yes, yes. It's great validation that we can bring back. We hope that you share the slides out so that we can also be the ones talking. We're exhausted. We didn't know if it was because we were getting older, but it's because of all that the data that you presented. And again, I appreciate it. You presented it, the objective, and we could tell you subjectively it's dead on. Thank you.
I guess our last question.
I was wondering if you could say anything about the predictive ability. Like, could you know something by the end of October about how students are likely to do over the course of the year? Or did any of you have access to partial day attendance? I know partial day attendance is also highly predictive of other outcomes that we care about. So if you could comment on sort of the predictive ability that you could look at in your data.
Yeah, so I'd say both looking at district data we use as well as what you saw in Texas, we have found that, yes, by the time that you get to around that 6-week period, that you can leverage those absences that students are missing to predict whether they are more likely to be absent from school later. We also show that in a paper that I did in graduate school back in 2017, looking at fall semester, spring semester, 30 days before next 30 days. So I think they're highly predictive of each other.
And not only can you use absences from the first period to predict, but you can use common sense and research-based evidence to know which students on your roster are likely to be chronically absent before the first day of school as well, just going back to some of what we were talking about earlier.
Great. I think that concludes our presentation. I want to thank the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause here. Fantastic. You find the reasons for absence through relationships. I think it absolutely starts with that. And yes, early chronic absence does predict later chronic absence. I'll just put on my hat as a Connecticut researcher, data person from Connecticut. We did look at that, and we did actually see that for different modes of learning, for in-person, hybrid, and remote, it absolutely does. So again, thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to the audience for the questions as well.
to the audience, we're going to take a break until 3:20, so you have 7 minutes to mill.
Okay, it's time to get started. Because now that we know the what, we're going to dig right into the why. But first, some introductions. So I'm Liz Cohen. I'm the Vice President of Policy at 50CAN. I'm also a research fellow at the Johns Hopkins University Institute for Education Policy. And I've, as Nat mentioned, been doing a lot of work. A lot of my work has been around trying to get states to make data more public and transparent around chronic absenteeism. I'm thrilled that we have a lot of data today from Rhode Island, which is a state I had spent a lot of time in for my own work. So I'm going to briefly introduce our research folks, and then we're going to jump in. So we're going to start with research that will be presented by Kevin G., who is the Director of School Policy Research and Action Center at the University of California at Davis. He's also joined in the audience by his colleague Peter Yu, who worked on it. There we'll look at reasons students give for being chronically absent. Arya, did you also work on that? You're double dipping here. Okay, Arya also worked on that one, but he's special, so he also did another one that he's gonna present on separately, which is research asking whether teacher absence patterns are connected to student absence patterns or attendance, however you wanna look at it. And then we are going to turn to Sam Holland from AEI on his work with Nat Malkus about, perfectly teed up in our last Q&A, how do we predict chronic absenteeism trends early in the school year? So we're going to start with Kevin G.
Thanks so much for that intro. Again, my name is Kevin G. I'm currently a professor at the University of California at Davis in the School of Education. Let me get set up here. So as Liz had mentioned, today I'm going to try to unpack this conversation that the first panel had around the reasons for absence. So what are the reasons that children are giving for absenteeism? And we're going to be leveraging data from Rhode Island to be able to do that. Again, this is a joint effort with Arya, as well as my research data analyst, also from UC Davis, Peter Yu. Also want to extend a thank you to Nat and his team, and also Rhode Island for providing the data. Without that data, we would not be able to actually unpack some of these patterns and reasons. So just let's get to our questions here. So we're going to look at how trends and reasons differed before and after what we're calling these COVID impact years. And we're considering 2020 to 2021 and 21 to 22 as those years that were most deeply impacted by COVID. And the second thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at what I call the COVID bump. So we're going to see the very last year before the COVID year, 2019 to 2020, we're going to compare the rates of reasons versus 23 and 24, just to see where there's a bump based on that. Now, why do we care about reasons? As we know, reasons link to the root causes, yes? Also, if we think about the reasons, we can identify change in what we're going to call malleable reasons, right? These are reasons that schools have some control over. They can include reasons linked to disengagement, reasons linked to, for example, if students don't have enough transportation, okay? We can also think about why reasons and the importance of that by thinking about the importance of prioritizing and also aligning resources to more higher prevalence reasons versus the lower prevalence reasons. So let's get into some of the data here. We're using data that's collected through the Panorama Education Survey. That data was collected, it's collected every year between MLK Day and March, so it's in the springtime. We're going to be using annual data from 2016-17 to 23-24. We have about over 200,000 elementary school students responding to that survey, and also about 440,000 secondary students in grades 6 through 12. Just to give you some context for this data, it's not the full universe because, of course, students always don't respond to surveys. So I just wanted to let you know we had lower response rates for higher grade levels. That's probably predictable. As students age, they don't want to respond to these surveys. A couple of other patterns in the data, we have lower response rates for males, white and Hispanic students, and then during the COVID year, the 2020-21 school year, response rates dropped to about 64%. I would say on average, response rates we're seeing are in the low 70s, so 72, 73%, but they dropped in the 2021 year. So that gives you some context for the data and who shows up in our results. Let's look at the side on reasons. Students were asked in general through this Panorama survey, why have you been absent from school? Now, that's not the ideal question to ask because it doesn't give a time frame. It just says, why were you absent in general? over the school year. Okay, we can talk about later in the Q&A more nuanced ways at getting at reasons. That said, there was a discrete number of reason categories that were asked of these students, and what we did is we grouped them just in terms of substantive reasons to look at family safety, well-being reasons. So students could, for example, say, well, I had to take care of someone else in the home, or I didn't feel safe at school, or I was being bullied. The second grouping that we made was around disengagement. So these are students reporting, it's boring, I didn't do my homework, and I've given up. And then finally, we have illness. Now, I was sick was an option that was added after the 2016-17 year, okay? So as I present these results, we're gonna see these results in these different categories, and then I'm gonna disaggregate results by elementary students and secondary students. So let's get to the results here. These are elementary students, grades 3 to 5. So here we see the trends over time between 2016-17 and 23-24. What I want to point out here is we see this kind of telltale sign of the dip going on in 2020 and 2021, and then with a rebound in 21 and 22. Again, just as a reminder, in the red here on this graph, the 2021 and the 21-22 are what we consider the COVID impact years. So again, we see this telltale sign of a dip and then a rebound effect that are actually above, in some cases, the pre-impact years. What I'll say also is the rank ordering of the reasons remains relatively similar, right? We're not seeing a huge number of kids saying, well, I'm not safe, spike after the COVID pandemic, okay? Now, all that said, do these trends look different? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna compare trends. We're gonna fit just trend lines through the data from 2016-17 through 2019-20. And then we're also gonna fit a trend line from 2022 to 23 and 2024 to see whether those two trend lines differ. And then we're also gonna ask about this COVID bump. So we're gonna ask about the year just prior to that COVID impact year, that first COVID impact year. We're gonna look at rates in 2019 and 20 and just compare those to 23-24. Okay. So on the next slide, you'll see a table here. You'll see, for example, the not enough sleep group that reported I wasn't getting enough sleep, so I was absent. We see a pre-trend, and this is in percentage points. So to Morgan's liking percentage points, I also like percentage points as well. So it's very small. We see a 0.22 increase each year in students reporting not enough sleep as the reason for why they're absent. Now, if we look at that post-trend, we see about a percentage point decline, right? And we also see whether or not it's significant. And there's a significant difference between those two trend lines. The last column that I want to point out is that bump. Right? So we're comparing the rates of kids reporting that they didn't get enough sleep in 1920 relative to 23-24, and we do see about a 2.3 percentage point bump going on. Okay, so there's higher levels. What I'll say overall, though, is most of the action in the reasons occur with the bumps, and we'll see that in the other reasons as we go through those. So again, rates are higher, relatively speaking, in 23-24 versus the 2019 and 20. Again, most of the reasons are, there's a bump of about a percentage point or a bit over that. So that's change in trends and levels for these reasons having to do with family, having to do with school safety and well-being. Let's look at disengagement, which we talked about earlier in the first panel. Here we're looking at rates of boring, given up, didn't do homework. What I want to point out here is really the action is going in the reason around boring, right? So for students reporting that school is boring, there is this post-trend increase. Okay, it's about 0.73 points per year relative to the decrease that was going on pre-pandemic. And then again, the action here is happening with the post-pandemic bump. Between 19 and 20 and 23-24, we see about a 1.5 percentage point increase in the students reporting that they missed school because it was boring, all right? Let's turn our attention to secondary students. These are students in grades 6 through 12. We see the same kind of reasons, very similar in terms of the order, but you'll notice not enough sleep is much higher, right? We're seeing about a third of students reporting that they didn't show up to school anytime during the school year because they did not get enough sleep. Now, Liz and I were just talking about that, like, what does that mean? We don't know. I think this is where the role of qualitative work needs to come in to be able to unpack that. So what I'll note, though, is unlike the other trends you saw for elementary students with the kind of the telltale COVID decline, we see actually an increase during that first COVID impact year. And then it falls back to kind of pre-pandemic levels. And again, most of the lower prevalence reasons show this dip with an increase post-pandemic. And then again, as with elementary students, the rank ordering of the reasons maintains relatively similar. Okay, these are also the change in trends and levels in the secondary reasons. I want to call your attention to 2 school-related malleable factors. That's the bumps that are going in with students reported that they didn't go to school because they were bullied. It's about 0.66 percentage points, and then we have about a percentage point bump for the kids who didn't attend school because kids were spreading rumors about them. Again, we don't know why, we don't know what kind of rumors, whether it was spread over social media, but that is an important trend to kind of look at. All right. So let's see here. Now we're going to be looking at the disengagement set of reasons: boring, given up, and didn't do homework. The action here is, I believe, is more in the kind of students who've just given up. We see a slight increase pre-pandemic and then a post-pandemic decline in the trend. And then we also see a lower kind of decline post-pandemic in the 23-24 year. Finally, we've talked about sick, right? Students reporting who they're sick. We see a decline in the 2020-21 year, and then also a rebound. What I'll say is that, again, the post-COVID bumps are much more relevant relative to the change in trends here. We do see much higher rates in the 23-24 year relative to the 2019 and 2020 year. About 3.3 percentage points for elementary students, and then 2.4 percentage points more students are reporting they were absent because they were sick in the 23-24 year, okay? All right, so what stayed the same? Sick, not enough sleep. Those are the most common reasons that students report both in elementary and secondary school why they're absent. The overall rank ordering that you've seen stays relatively the same pre and post-pandemic, and then these post-COVID bumps relative to change in trends are more prominent. So what does this all mean? So when we think about the malleable reasons that I talked about, elementary students are increasingly reporting things like school is boring, right, for being absent, which I think signals something a bit about school and disengagement. And so I think there is a role for schools to think about how do we make our schools more engaging? How do teachers make their lessons more engaging? That's important to think about. Second thing, secondary students are reporting slightly higher rates of absences due to bullying, which may point to some school climate issues. Again, this is something well within the control of schools to think about. If we turn to more of the less malleable reasons, right, to the point around a lot of what drives absenteeism is also related to non-school factors. We have these health and well-being reasons, especially sick. Sick has always been the highest rate of reasons why kids don't show up to school. That said, both elementary students, secondary students, post-pandemic are frequently reporting being sick, but also not getting enough sleep as well. Okay, so I think these are 2 areas to continue to kind of think about, and we need to continue doing some thinking about as we're, if we want to kind of decrease these post-COVID bumps. Looking forward to taking your questions during the Q&A session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And now we have Arya Ansari from The Ohio State University, who will present on teacher and student absences and whether or not they're related.
I appreciate the inclusion of the Ohio State University. My colleagues always give me hell about that because I just say OSU, but here we are. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today about the relations between teacher and student absences. Let's see, how does this work? That's not that button. Sorry about that. So I just want to set the stage about why we're here talking about teacher and student absences. So I think everyone has acknowledged that we know that there's been a bump in absences among students from relative to pre-pandemic times, which disrupts learning and well-being. At the same time, we've also heard evidence and seen evidence that teachers are more frequently absent today than they were pre-pandemic times. Despite this parallel increase, we actually know very little, either pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, about what these associations might look like. So do teachers' absences contribute to students' absences? With that said, about 15 years back, there was some work that suggested that when teachers were more frequently absent, their students did less well academically in terms of standardized test scores and whatnot. So as we think about our post-pandemic recovery with respect to the elevated levels of absenteeism, it's important we consider different explanations or possibilities as we try to bring our rates back down. And one of these points of conversation that you oftentimes hear is the role of teachers. So today, I'm going to address three broader objectives. The first of which is purely descriptive, and it's just to document the trends in teacher and student absences. Then we're going to examine the relations between the two. And then I'm going to unpack these associations and tap into variability as a function of grade level. So thinking about associations between teacher-student absences for elementary school kids, middle school kids, and high school kids. And then documenting these trends pre-COVID and post-COVID. So I use data from the Rhode Island Department of Education between 2017-18 and 23-24. These data represent about 320 schools, and there are about 210,000 unique students that contributed multiple data points. In total, what we're talking about is roughly 1.9 million observations over this 7-year period that we're going to capitalize on. So, what did students' absences look like? So I pulled from administrative records, which included days absent, the number of days kids were late to school, and the number of days kids left school early. And I'm going to plot these estimates for you by year. That's represented on the x-axis, ranging from 17-18 all the way through 23-24. And they'll be in orange, blue, and this dark blue, blackish color, respectively. And then what we're going to have on the y-axis is just the number of days kids engaged in those behaviors. So pre-pandemic, what you'll find, or what we see, is that kids missed roughly 12 to 13 full days of school. There was some slight changes in the number of days they were tardy, ranging from 5 to roughly 7 days. And in terms of days of early dismissal, it ranged in the ballpark of 2 to 3 days per year. There's a slight dip in the 2019-2020 school year, but relatively stable overall. Then as we progress into the heights of the pandemic, so 2020, 2021, and 2021, 2022, what we see is an increase in each of those behaviors. Days absent peaks to about 17 to 18 days. Days tardy increases to about 10 days. And there is a slight increase in the days that students left early, about 3.5 days. Then as we exit the peaks of the pandemic, we see that with respect to full day absences, as others have shown, there is a slight recovery, but we continue to be higher than where we were pre-pandemic. But what I find interesting is in terms of days tardy and days of early dismissal, those have not reverted back to normal. And in fact, with respect to days tardy, we've seen roughly a doubling relative to different years during the pre-pandemic time. So we're at about 12 days of tardies now. And early dismissals are at their highest point in 23-24. So when we take that all together, what we see is there is a COVID disruption. Absence patterns have changed over time. For full day absences, we see that it's peaked during COVID, and it's dropped a little bit, but not fully back to pre-pandemic times. But there's been a shift in those tardies and early dismissals. So, teachers' absences. I'm going to show it to you all in the exact same format, and I'm going to just plot full day absences and part date absences, which were derived from administrative record. And this just includes personal leave and sick leave. Pre-COVID, what we see is that teachers were missing school or missing work about 10 to 13 days, depending on the year, full days. And part days, what we're talking about is 1 to 2 days per year. Then as we progress to the peaks of COVID, what we see is a rise to about 15 days in the 21-22 school year full day absences. And part day absences are relatively stable in that 1 to 2 day ballpark. And then as we exit the peaks of COVID, what we see is that those rates of full day absences drop a little bit, but they're not at their pre-pandemic levels, and those part day absences are relatively stable. So with respect to teachers' absences, we also see a similar pattern. Some stability in those early years, a rapid rise during the pandemic, and a small drop post-pandemic, but we're still at higher levels. And what is, I think, interesting to note is that rise in the pandemic period a good chunk of that is explained by pre-approved leave. So that explains some of that rapid increase. So those are the descriptive trends. Now I want to talk about what these associations look like. So I'm going to capitalize on within student variation and teacher absences and talk about how a one-day increase in a teacher's absence contributes to different outcomes, including days absent, days tardy, and days of early dismissal, in addition to the number of days students were absent for unexcused reasons and their likelihood of being chronically absent, which means missing 10% or more of the school year. So what do we find? These estimates are pretty darn close to zero as you can get. So just looking at that first one, what that would suggest is that for a single day increase in a student's teacher's absence, that contributes to less than a 0.001 day change in an individual student's absence. And you can see that across the board, even when things are statistically significant, like days tardy and days early dismissal, they are pretty close to zero as you can get. And I've looked at these looking at thresholds, so looking at 10 or more absences, 20 or more absences, excluding pre-approved leave. All of it ends up being close to zero. So what you see here is basically the general trends. Pretty negligible associations between a teacher's absence and a student's absence. When I disaggregate these associations or these trends for elementary, middle, and high school kids, what I find is that the associations are pretty comparable across all those grade levels. There is, though, some suggestive evidence that the links between a teacher's absence and a student's tardies are slightly stronger at the high school period, followed by the middle school period, and then weakest in the elementary school years. But what I would emphasize is that these differences amount to less than 0.01 days across those grade bands. So again, pretty negligible, suggesting that the overall associations are pretty comparable across grade levels. And then finally, when I look at these trends pre-COVID versus post-COVID, what I find is minimal change. Although there is some statistically significant increases in these associations post-COVID, these differences, again, amount to about 0.01 days. So teachers' absences continue to be a negligible correlate of students' absences. That was true pre-COVID, that was true during the height of COVID, and that is now true at the end post-COVID. So what are the take-home messages? Well, the first of which, as we all know, students' absences are higher today than they were pre-pandemic. But what these data suggest is that that is also true for teachers in terms of full-day absences. What I think is interesting and important to note is that although we've seen a slight drop in those full-day absences, we have seen continued rise in those tardies and early dismissals for students. Despite these increases and changes, there's actually no strong link between a teacher's absence and a student's absence across elementary, middle, and high school periods. And at the end of the day, these absences among teachers don't actually contribute to the post-COVID bump that we've seen in student absences. So as we think about efforts to address the post-COVID absenteeism crisis that we're all here talking about today, our efforts are likely going to have to target other factors because targeting teachers' absences isn't going to move the needle with respect to student absences. So I'll stop there, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Arya. I'm so excited I have so many questions for you, but I know you're all dying to ask so many questions. It's like 3:30 on a Friday, and we're so excited for the final presentation of this particular panel, which is going to be Sam from the AEI, who's going to talk about how we can predict absences. Or not. Who knows what he's going to say? I hope you're all in suspense.
So I'm excited to talk about some research that Nat Malkus and I, along with our intern Yuhan Ma, have begun exploring how we can predict absenteeism in advance. Past work has established that this is very possible to do, But we often get focused on the details, the numbers, the methods, et cetera. What we'd like to do today is to take the district leader's perspective and try to see what we can learn from these systems to help us figure out when interventions might be most effective, and to see if we can do it using the data that districts already routinely collect. First, why would we want better prediction? And why would we want it right now? There's two big problems that we see with the recent surge in absenteeism that make it particularly difficult to deal with. One is that it's intense. This is what we've been talking about throughout the day. Chronic absenteeism nearly doubled. But the other less talked about problem is that it was diffuse. The problem occurred nearly everywhere, in rich districts, in poor districts, low achieving and high achieving, urban and rural districts, and as we heard from Jacob's presentation earlier, regardless of a student's prior absenteeism, on average, we're seeing an increase in their absences now. This makes it really difficult to know where to target resources. Who do you help when every student potentially could be a candidate for help? This is why early warning systems could be particularly valuable right now. We have a way to cut through the noise, so to speak, and to figure out where resources are best targeted. That could be very helpful in getting us back to a pre-pandemic baseline. Now, it's key to pause here and make sure we're not just talking about chronic absenteeism. We can apply the approach we're going to talk about to your chosen metric. It could be ADA, et cetera. But I'm going to focus on our results for chronic absenteeism for the sake of time here. We trained 3 different models using a machine learning approach, one to predict whether a student will be chronically absent at the end of an academic year, another to predict the number of absences the student will have, and a third to predict the change in absences from last year, because maybe we're interested in knowing whose absenteeism is getting worse and whose is better. We trained the model on a large panel of data from Rhode Island, about 117,000 students from the 2015 to 16 and 2016 to 17 school years to start. And we included data both from the prior year and from the current year. And here, district leaders, you could include whatever data you already collect. We've included an intentionally minimal set of predictors that most districts should already have access to. But if you have more data, you could throw that in the model and we would potentially be able to get as good or better of results with some care about how we do it. We're taking a very flexible approach. So we include the prior year's absences by month and the current year's absences accumulated up to the date we're wanting to make a prediction at. And to give context to that accumulated total of absences, we also include the time we're making the prediction during the year, the number of days the student's been enrolled up till then, because 10 absences on week 2 means something very different from 10 absences 6 months into the year. And finally, we include demographics. And here we just include 2. We include the student's grade, and we include their lunch status, free, reduced price lunch, or normal status lunch. We could also include other variables, but we found they just didn't add very much. It's pennies on the dollar in terms of predictive power. The first question we can look at is, how well can we predict absenteeism? At the beginning of the year, using just prior year's data, we are able to get our predictions for whether students will be chronically absent correct about 89% of the time. About halfway through the year, that's risen to about 93% of the time. But that makes sense. We already have half the answer to whether the student is going to be chronically absent by then, and the student has likely already accumulated many absences by the time we're making the prediction, or they haven't, and we'll know that as well. From one perspective, this is a pretty impressive increase over the course of the year because we've cut the number or the percentage that we are incorrectly classifying down by about 1/3, from 11% to about 7%. But from a different perspective, this isn't so impressive. At the start of the year, we have, if we're focused on the students we are correctly classifying, almost as many correct as we do halfway through the year. In this context, it might not make that much sense to wait to intervene when we could prevent absences beforehand. We already, with high certainty, know whether a student will become chronically absent before the year has even begun. Another key question here is how the predictions hold up over time. So far, I've showed results for the year that the model was trained on. That's making predictions for 2016 to 17 academic year. But we would ideally want a model that is able to be trained in one year and then work in subsequent years, and that's exactly what we see. The top 3 lines here are showing the pre-pandemic years. We see very little decline in accuracy for those years. And then during the pandemic, especially early on in the year, we see a much larger decline in predictive accuracy. And this also makes sense. There were different reasons a student might be absent during the pandemic. They could be sick more often. There were changes in lockdown status, et cetera, that make it, to some extent, fundamentally more difficult to predict if we're seeing the sort of acute absenteeism, for example, that we saw in one of our previous presentations. But also, the model was just trained in a different year. If you retrained the model in the pandemic, you could probably get better pandemic performance as well. But what's really interesting is that if we look at that last year, the yellow line for 23 to 4, we have approaching the same level of accuracy that we do 7 years earlier. The same things that predicted chronic absenteeism in 2016 to 17 still predict it in 23 to 4. In the middle, something changed, but it seems we've changed back even though the amount of absenteeism has stayed high. So there's 3 lessons we can draw from this. One is that we can accurately predict chronic absenteeism and build early warning systems, relatively easy to do so. We knew we could predict it already. What we've shown here is that it's possible to do with a relatively simple model using currently available data that almost every district could come up with. And we could further tailor the models to the particular context in a given state or district. The second lesson is that absenteeism is highly predictable at the start of the year. Absenteeism should seldom come as a surprise, even when we're making predictions before the year has even begun. It's hard to justify delaying interventions until absences have accumulated. And finally, absenteeism is about as predictable today as it was during the pre-pandemic. If we retrained a model, as we have done, on the most recent data, we could probably close the gap, get that predictive accuracy up straight to the same level as we have at in the very first pre-pandemic years we're looking at. So we're still able to predict just as well as we could before the pandemic. It may be that the nature of absenteeism has returned to something similar to what it was before the pandemic, even though the amount is different, although we can't get at the mechanisms with this research alone. There are several ways we're extending this work right now. One is that we're customizing the models to better fit the decision-making processes of districts, for example, with the timing of predictions during the year. We're building models for additional states, such as Indiana. And we are planning to make a version of these models available freely to use. We want to get them into decision makers' hands as soon as we can so that we can start testing them in the wild. So the bottom line here is that we can anticipate absenteeism with current resources. And at this point, there's very little reason not to use the data we have. Let's use what we have to intervene, to target interventions, and see if we can cut through the noise. Even though this is a very diffuse problem that we're facing, we do have the resources to sort through and to figure out where resources can best be spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. So 2 panels in, it feels like there's this a little bit of an enigma, right? It seems like the research is saying kind of everything we knew before COVID still exists, but it's at this higher level. And I want to first say that I think it's really important that we know this because, as Nat said at the beginning, everything we knew before COVID doesn't count anymore, so it's important we know this again now. But my first question, which may or may not be remotely fair given your areas of expertise, is if in fact we have this enigma and we have this continued, high levels of absenteeism that we can't quite explain, what's the next research that you all want to do to help us figure out what's really going on and what we can do about it? I'd start with a softball, right? Kevin seems excited.
Seems excited. That's the operative word. I think to get at the heart of what's going on, we need to do more qualitative work. I paired with quantitative data. That's one thing. I also think there's 2 things going on that I've heard kind of when I speak with districts and superintendents and principals and teachers. I think one thing is the value proposition of schools, just what the purpose of education is, has shifted in many respects. I mean, this idea that, well, you can make up school online, you can just log on, that kind of devalues devalues the value of education. I also think this idea, especially in states like California, where you can make up days in some instances by just coming in on Saturday, and that automatically erases your absence. So that idea also, I'll just be blunt, kind of cheapens this idea of why you're going to school, right? It misses the point that we go to school not only to build our skills, but there's a whole socialization aspect to our schools as well. So that's one thing to kind of dig in on and maybe unpack through qualitative work. I think the second thing is the trust and engagement that I've seen in some cases break apart during the pandemic. I think some of the work I've done with bright spot schools in California has shown that schools that had strong levels of engagement and trust and continued that trend through the pandemic had lower levels of chronic absence. I mean, they still increased, but this idea that we're here to support your kids, and just even the straightforward, simple messaging, light touch, low cost things, like a principal greeting his students at the door and knowing their name can make a huge difference, right? You think about a parent, hey, my principal knows my kid's name, I feel comfortable sending my kid to school. So I think those are kind of two areas to continue to drill down on.
And I guess to go off that, so we actually did some work out in Ohio looking at this idea of school belonging and its role in student attendance, and we see that it is a key correlate of whether students show up to school. And it's not just how they feel at the beginning of the year, but it's how their sense of their school changes over the year. And so we see a pretty consistent drop from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and that is a key predictor of student attendance as well. So it's not just building these connections early on, but it's thinking about maintaining those relationships and connections as students return back from winter break, as they return back from spring break, because both are important factors. And that's particularly true for the middle school and high school kids. And the other thing I would note, similar to Morgan, we've interviewed families about why their kids missed school last year. And one of the common themes we're saying is that beyond the barriers that with respect to transportation and being kids getting on city buses for 2 hours and that not being worth their time, is this idea of it not being exciting or engaging, and similar to what Kevin was showing, that it's potentially boring. And so thinking about how we can re-engage students and make learning fun in the age in which we're at with respect to AI in terms of going forward. So those are two areas that I wanted to touch on.
Yeah, one other area that I'll just add is teasing out sort of two different explanations that seem still to be very prominent and both potentially good for why we've seen the increase in absenteeism. There's sort of the things have gotten worse, there's new challenges, and then there's our responses to the same things have changed. So some of the school culture questions, for example, and the relationship between parents and schools, for example, may have changed. So some of the work we're looking at doing next is looking, for instance, at common predictors for absenteeism that have always been in place. Bad weather, for example. We're also looking at sports participation, for example, that might be a mitigator for absenteeism. And seeing, do we see changes in the response to those existing factors? Because maybe most of the difference is behavioral, maybe it's a cultural change, or maybe that's not the explanation. Maybe there are structural factors at play. And so moving beyond the sort of self-reports and survey data that we have access to, and are sort of augmenting those with behavioral data, looking at these common factors, so we can start to figure out how much of this is as sort of revealed by the actual behavior of students and families, sort of changes in behavior versus these outside factors.
Well, we solved it. So we'll move on to the next question. But so Arya, I want to ask, so you talked about whether or not teacher absences change student absences. I'm curious about whether you also considered the inverse. Does student absenteeism impact teacher absences? Ultimately, I care a lot, for instance, if kids go to school. But the only reason I care about that is because I care if kids learn and have opportunities to be thriving members of society. So I'm curious if you looked at kind of, as you know, I think you said, right, we know that teacher absences can lead to lower student achievement, so we might care about whether there's a relationship in the other direction.
So the short answer to that is no, but it's totally doable with the data that we have from Rhode Island. But I will put a plug in for some work that Michael Gottfried led that shows that teachers are less satisfied with their profession and with their jobs when their students are more frequently absent. So Certainly I can follow up on that and get you an answer.
Oh,
But
great.
not as of today.
Because you did not get enough sleep last night.
No.
Kevin, to our favorite answer, right?
Yes.
To the list of questions, I mean, look, there's a lot of things that I think are imperfect. You outlined some of them about the list, but we work with the data that we have. But if you could have the data that you want, and if you were talking to, say, a district superintendent who maybe is working with Panorama or someone else on how to design some kind of survey instrument that could get maybe more useful or practical information, like what would you start with?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things come to mind. One is the way the question is structured. It's like, were you absent at any time during the school year for these reasons? And I think putting some better boundaries on are certain reasons more prevalent during certain parts of the school year. I think that's one important thing to think about. That said, I know these surveys are very long, right? So now you're adding sub-questions to this main question around why you're absent. Another thing is there is an open-ended part to that question that we didn't talk about, which it is students can write in anything they want to, which I think is good. I think, though, school districts tend to be, data rich, but analysis poor. And so the extent to which we can also partner with states to say, hey, you have a lot of rich, open-ended data around this. Can we help you actually look at patterns within that as well? And then I'll also say is that a lot of these reasons overlap with each other, right? So the more that we can also think about how these reasons intersect. And then I'll also say one more thing. You didn't see questions like transportation, right? You didn't see questions around the systemic challenges. You had trouble with finding housing, trouble with food, right? So the extent to which, I highlighted some of the malleable school factors, we still don't know a lot about kind of the structural reasons that are driving absences. And then also linking this data to chronic absenteeism, right? I think that's one of the big questions. How much of these reasons are actually driving what's going on with chronic absenteeism? We can do some of that work. We haven't done that yet, but I think that's an important question to also ask and answer with the data.
Yeah, so Sam, when you look at some of the existing literature and just conversation around early warning systems that have been tried for a few years now, particularly around chronic absenteeism, like one of the kind of criticisms is that an early warning system alone isn't enough for a district to go on. That you kind of need the why in order for a school or a district to have something to do. So as you're thinking about, working with other districts and states on building this model, like are you guys trying to think about how do you build a predictive model that maybe ideally has some of this, what are the factors, whether that's, transportation or lack of engagement or other pieces, so that it becomes more instantly actionable by schools or districts?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yeah, this is one piece of sort of a broader bunch of research that we're doing. In part, we're trying to identify some of those specific reasons students sort of reveal by their behavior that they might be absent, so we can figure out what appropriate interventions might be. And yeah, I guess the short answer is we'd love to merge those lines of research. I think another piece here is that we would never want a district to just use an early warning system like this. To some extent, it's this sort of 1,000-foot view of what's going on the ground, and which is mostly valuable to people who are 1,000 feet away. And to some extent, we would expect educators and school leaders to already have some version of the same information in their heads about how students are doing if they know their students as individuals to some degree. So the information it's providing is somewhat redundant. And it is one value beyond just providing specific predictions is that it can provide authority or empower people who are in those positions who already have access to some of this information to say, look, we're paying attention to the right groups of students. We need more resources to be able to intervene in these ways.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent a lot of time saying over the last few years that I think that a lot of the work on this issue comes down to two things: information and relationships, and you need both of those pieces. And so the question for all of you is, so one of the things that came out, I mean, at least from Kevin's data, right, is that the why answers, at least on the limited data we have, seem kind of the same between elementary and secondary. But in most of the conversations we're having around absenteeism, we see kind of different trends or different reasons, different motivations. We often talk about elementary absences as a parent problem, secondary as a student problem, things like that. So I'm curious for all of you, are you surprised by the data, that Kevin presented or that you've been working with? Do you think there are other pieces to unpack, perhaps on the why question between our younger students and our older students?
I think for us, the interesting patterns around caring for others, we don't quite know what that means, especially in the elementary school context. So Peter and I sat down and thought, well, what could this mean? Like, what could a third grader say who they're taking care of? So we don't quite know what's driving some of that. And again, I think drilling down on what's behind that is going to be important. In terms of the like Arya's results, I think there is something to be said about, if a teacher's not there, perhaps a student thinks, well, that teacher doesn't care about me, and so then I'm not going to kind of show up. But again, the data is showing that that's necessarily not the kind of narrative behind that. And then to Sam's work around predictive modeling, I think if schools can, if they can identify students from the get-go, and again, to your point around connecting them with resources early on, and not letting it drag on into the year to say, oh, finally, we're going to connect you with the resources you need to show up to school. I think that's a good thing. I do want to say one thing just about the early warning systems, though. Sometimes it's a double-edged sword. I don't think we want to necessarily identify a kid as chronically absent and then have the negative, kind of punitive things that happen, because some school districts still use a punitive kind of counterproductive approach and send threatening letters home and whatnot. So the more that we can say, well, okay, we've seen this early warning, what does this mean? Approaching it much more from a kind of continuous improvement, how do we help you and how do we support you relative to getting nasty letters, which parents do not respond well to.
Either you guys have anything to add to that?
The only other thing I would add is, especially in early childhood, so Morgan showed the kindergarten rates being some of those gaps, but we know that those rates are even higher in early childhood. So thinking about the age 3 and 4-year-olds in preschool. And so it's thinking about parents' perceptions of the importance of early childhood education, which spans preschool to 3rd grade, and communicating that, kids are learning. It might be through play, but there is active learning socially and academically. And so everyday miss does matter. And so some of it, especially in those early years, is about the messaging about the importance of regular attendance, because we've seen from some work in different communities that people might think it's just preschool. What could be happening there? Or it's just kindergarten. What's going on? It's not much. It's not 3rd grade or it's not 5th grade. And we actually did some interviews in Columbus, and parents, at least one thing I remember specifically is a parent was like, my kid's in 1st grade or 2nd grade. It's not 5th grade yet. It's not quite that important. And so I think some of that messaging of what's happening in school and in these classrooms is critical early on.
Yeah, I love that. And we're going to turn now to audience Q&A, but I'll just throw my 2 cents, which is that I think it's okay for school to be boring, and I'd like us to have a conversation around the fact that expectations around school shouldn't always be driven by that it's more fun to watch Dora the Explorer. And with that, we'd love to take questions from the audience.
What is your advice for people who are in states where we have no data? And I'm in New York, like we're #1 in spending in education. We have no data available. So like Rhode Island's is a dream. How much do you advise of just taking this research and then applying to other states? Or do you think that, a word of caution is advised here?
Yeah, I can take that one. So the first thing is, you don't have to have the exact same data or even close to the same granularity of data as Rhode Island has to create systems that work pretty well. We've also tested systems that just use annual data. As long as districts are able to count the number of absences a student has had during the previous year and have perhaps their grade and some other basic information, that's enough to make pretty good predictions. So if you have more granular data, then in this case we used monthly data. We also tried weekly, and then we didn't get much more out of that. That's already enough. So it's a very district by district, case by case situation. But in general, I would expect that even in New York and in most states, it would be possible to build systems that have a pretty good accuracy. What we're doing now is seeing just how good. We're looking at several other states to see how well our results generalize. Our paper on that should be coming out in a few weeks, and we can see that picture more clearly.
I would also just quickly say, I assume most schools are collecting absenteeism data, yes? That exists kind of at the school level. So perhaps that's where you can get more traction with actually creating a kind of culture around data use, right? Relative to kind of some centralized kind of data source. But that takes time, and I think time and time again, through some of my work, sometimes it takes a leader who's just a champion of this and who says, we're going to commit to this, we're going to double down on trying to get our kids back into school, and we're going to use a kind of data-driven approach to be able to do that. And so cultivating leaders who are data aware, data sensitive, and know how to use the data strategically also, because data can also be tied to resources, right? In California, average daily attendance drives funding. And so we get people to the table saying, if your kids don't show up, you're not getting resources. So this becomes your financial bottom line that is being hard hit by this. So I think the more we can also align the justification for focusing on attendance with some of the incentives that districts face. And again, in California, districts are facing budget cuts. So the conversation around attendance and funding is an extremely important one to hook them.
And I think the only other thing I would add is just being mindful about how different schools, districts, states measure attendance. It can be wildly different, and so I think it's important to always be cautious about what we're comparing because it might not always be apples to apples. Some places have very different definitions of what it means to be present for the day versus other districts. So in Columbus City Schools, it's per hour, whereas other districts or other states don't necessarily do that. So I think just as you schools and districts and states think about what's happening elsewhere, it's just being mindful of how other areas are measuring these things as well.
It's 60% of the day in DC.
I was talking with somebody and they said if you showed up for a period or two, you counted as present for the day. And I will just leave it at that.
So chronic absenteeism is big business these days. I work in a school district, 160,000 students, 211 schools. So I'm regularly approached by companies with dollar signs in their eyes trying to sell us their product. And my question is there an opportunity for school districts and universities and others to share information and resources and technology to everybody's collective benefit? Instead.
Is that data you're offering up? Because that sounds pretty good to a lot of folks in here.
I mean, we certainly have data. I'm in Montgomery County, just north of, just right over the Maryland border. I mean, we certainly have data that we can share, but it's just, I'm thinking particularly like parent outreach efforts that many, many companies have created, whether they're AI related or not, and we're trying to build things within our own technology department, and I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to share information like that.
Sam, you're the builder on the panel, so you want to take that one?
I guess the short answer is that sounds great. I mean, the more information we have, the better. As far as sort of building larger systems or tools like the ones I was discussing earlier, those definitely don't have to cost money. You can set those up relatively easily. That's what we're hoping to do, and those really shouldn't need to be an expensive product. Sharing strategies and so on, the sort of folk wisdom and so on that's been built up at schools and districts, that's, I think, something much harder to bring together and something much harder to sort of share in and so on. I imagine that would be a super valuable effort that should definitely happen.
You should also talk to Rhode Island because they built their things in-house with a small team of brilliant data folks. And size-wise, like I think there's a lot of lessons learned that could apply in Montgomery County from Rhode Island. So you guys should connect. Okay, so we are now going to take another short break before we resume for our final panel of the day. So if everyone could join me in thanking again our wonderful panelists, Sam, Arya, and Kevin.
Yeah, probably. Also, I don't know if like it was some sort of this event, like we were gonna wait until the sort of signal here before you give the mic. Yeah. But because that's how I was doing it. Like there was like a question for staff, and then yeah, and I was like,
Okay, great. Welcome to the final session of the day, the best session of the day, hopefully, also. As Nat introduced at the beginning, my name's Catherine Faulkner. I'm a Harkness Fellow and visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm visiting from the UK. I think it's important to say we are also seeing a similar challenge with school attendance in the UK, and it's been brilliant for me to come over here and learn from all of these people and hopefully take a lot of ideas back with me. The particular work I'm doing over here is applying a public health lens to the challenge of chronic absenteeism. So really thinking of what chronic absence tells us about how well the wider system is meeting the needs of children and families. And I think a lot of the research we've heard this afternoon has really kind of backed up that perspective. This session, though, is really focused on the consequences of chronic absence today, and we're going to hear 3 more presentations. So we're going to hear the research of David Blazer, Associate Professor of Education Policy at the University of Maryland, Seth Gershenson, Professor of Public Administration and Policy at American University, and Ethan Hutt, Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of North Carolina. And their group's going to share 2 presentations focused on the effects of absenteeism, as well as how absenteeism has affected post-pandemic recovery. And we're also going to hear again from the work of Nat and Sam here at AEI, who are going to be talking about their work to examine how chronic absence has impacted student graduation rates. So we're going to kick off hearing from Seth, whose team have used data from Maryland and North Carolina to look at the effects of absenteeism on academic performance.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And really thanks to Nat for organizing a great event and getting all these different folks together. It's a pleasure to be a part of it, pleasure to do the work with a great team. So let's... What do I do? Green button. Great. Okay. So the first paper that our team wrote is sort of revisiting an older paper that a few folks in the room have written, which is studying the effects of absenteeism. So that's all 3 of us. I would argue, and hopefully most folks in the room agree, that the causal effect of student absenteeism on student achievement is well established. And as an economist, I want to be, particular about the idea of a causal effect, not just a correlation, not just things that tend to move together, but a direct effect of absences on achievement. And I'll talk a little bit about the literature there, but basically, we find that 10 absences lower end-of-grade test scores by about 4% of a test score standard deviation. So what is a test score standard deviation? Well, we can standardize test scores in such a way that we can compare test scores across years or across different tests on a standard metric where the standard deviation equals 1. And so is 4% of a standard deviation a big deal or not? That's a subjective question, and you can make that decision on your own. But to give some context, I would say that yes, it's enough to care about, and it's enough to think seriously about, because this is similar to the effect, the causal effect of other school-provided inputs that we can identify experimentally or through other rigorous research. For example, this is about what a 1/3 standard deviation increase in teacher quality would do to test scores. So moving from a slightly below average teacher to a teacher at the 75th or 80th percentile, a pretty, not huge, but non-trivial jump in teacher quality does a similar thing to student test scores. We could also think about it in terms of days in school. And this is equivalent to about a month of learning, or about 15% of a school year in terms of learning gains. Now, in terms of why there's a causal effect and why I'm even, blabbering on about causal effects versus correlation, I guess 2 basic points. First, as we've already seen from a lot of the descriptive results in the prior 2 panels, different students are absent at different rates. And what does that suggest to us? It suggests that there's a lot of reasons that kids are absent and that those reasons vary across kids. But a lot of those reasons also directly affect performance, also directly affect test scores in ways that have nothing to do with absences. And so if we ignore having a research design that tries to isolate this causal effect, we are going to conflate the effect of those other things on student test scores with the effect of absences. So the statisticians would call the confounding factors. So I'll get to how we try to address that in our study. But I do want to note that there's a lot of other stuff going on, right, that drives test scores. Okay, so let's assume that we can identify these causal effects of absences. What are the mechanisms, or what are the reasons that absences would harm achievement? One is probably the most obvious thing, is that, well, if you're not in school, you're not learning, right? And you're missing out on instructional time, and that's a big part of it. But on top of that, and I think Morgan's survey alluded to this a little bit, there's also a coordination cost here of catching up. And so, yes, you can try to catch up on that lost instructional time. I am of Morgan's vintage, and I also remember getting the take-home packet of papers. But whether you're doing that, or you're going on Zoom, or there's some sort of app or something that's helping you make up that work, even if you do all that, that's taken time from other things, right? Maybe you get a little less sleep. Maybe you have to miss a soccer game or something. It's displacing other activities, and it's difficult to catch up, especially when you're on your own, maybe. A related issue is what I'll say, losses beget losses. And at some point, catching up gets harder and harder the more catching up you have to do. And especially if what you're catching up on or what you initially missed are some sort of fundamental building blocks, right, of learning. And if you miss some of those fundamental building blocks, it can be, maybe even impossible to catch up on more advanced stuff that you then miss down the road. Okay, and then today in our paper, we're focusing on test scores as a simple, easily measurable, available metric of learning, but there's credible evidence that absences harm all sorts of other outcomes as well, including attainment measures like graduation, college enrollment, so on and so forth. Okay, so this study is really based on the prior research I mentioned. I have a 2017 paper using data from North Carolina and the nationally representative ECLS case survey, which is nationally representative of U.S. public school, elementary school students. I also have a paper with Jing Liu, who's in the back, using data from California, doing something pretty similar. Different contexts, slightly different methods, but both papers isolate causal effects by making apples-to-apples comparisons of finding kids who have very similar home lives, very similar prior achievement records, very similar prior attendance records, and comparing, once we limit our comparisons to those really similar students, looking at what happens when there's a marginal difference in absence between the students. In both cases, in all these different contexts, we find a remarkably linear effect of absences. And I'll get on my soapbox to really say this again, because we've used the word chronic absence a lot, talked a lot about comparing chronically absent to non-chronically absent students. What I mean by linear here is that the effect of one additional absence is about the same whether it's your first absence of the year, or your 5th absence of the year, or your 10th absence of the year, or the 20th absence of the year. That marginal effect of one additional absence is roughly the same. That doesn't mean that we should not care about chronic absence, because if you're chronically absent, which might mean 18 or more absences, usually in most states, maybe 15, 20, whatever. The point is that just because it's marginal, these one absence increments are all the same. If you compare someone with no absences to somebody with 20 absences, it adds up really quickly, those small marginal one-off effects. But I do want to stress this linearity thing, because it highlights the fact that there's nothing magical about 18 absences. And if we somehow, get everybody to be only absent 17 times and make the chronic absent rate 0, we're not solving any sort of problem. So chronic absenteeism is a useful measure. It's a concept that we're familiar with. It's easy to report, easy to measure, easy to talk about, but there's nothing magical about 18 absences. Okay. And so what we really want to focus on then is those papers were published a while ago using data from even more of a while ago. Do those findings hold up today, post-COVID? There's a lot of reasons to think that maybe they don't hold up because the world has changed in all sorts of ways post-COVID. The first bullet we've already talked a lot about today, absenteeism rates are higher, right? And that's why we're here. Well, that makes me think, okay, maybe the reasons for absences are different. And we've heard some of that in some of the earlier talks. But at a very basic level, I'm pretty confident, because in my own life I know this has happened, social norms regarding in-person attendance at things has changed. Whether it's, meeting with the doctor or, whatever. It doesn't have to be just in school. And so those social norms have changed. And that means for sure that the reasons for absences have changed, right? We're going to be absent now for reasons that would not have caused us to be absent in the past. I should say some of that might be good, right? It's probably good to stay home when you're definitely sick and contagious. So that has changed. But the other thing that's changed, and what Morgan alluded to in one of his survey results, I think, is that there have been dramatic changes in technology that have made it, in theory at least, easier to catch up from an absence, easier to make up missed work following an absence. And whether that's having a telemeeting with your teacher, Zoom calls with classmates, apps that share material or study keys, or even just watching recorded lectures or recorded exercises or whatever. All sorts of technological changes have suggested that maybe absences are not as harmful as they used to be because it's easier to make them up. And spoiler, we might find that in a few slides. So we are going to revisit the question using similar methods to these prior peer-reviewed published studies, using the same data from North Carolina that I used in the first study, and new data from Maryland, from the MLDS. And we're going to use the same methods as before. These are so-called value-added methods that are pretty common in education research. That's just a fancy way of saying we're going to make apples-to-apples comparisons by holding constant prior achievement, prior attendance, home background, so on and so forth. So we're going to get really similar kids who are similar on all sorts of different levels. And we're going to make those comparisons within classrooms or within teachers. So we're going to compare two kids in the exact same second grade classroom who had very, very similar test scores the year before, very, very similar home lives, but they have slightly different levels of absences this year, and see what happens. So that's our plan. Okay. This is the Maryland and North Carolina version of the picture you've been seeing all day about chronic absent rates basically doubled post-COVID. And that's true in both of these states. And I should say, I was telling someone at the break, it's really remarkable to me how similar these pictures look at whatever state or whatever district you pull data from. Okay, so chronic absenteeism rates more or less doubled. And here are our findings. The blue lines are pre-COVID. The red lines are post-COVID. And what we see in both states is that the red line is a little bit flatter. And the slope of this line is the effect of one additional absence. And so by being flatter, it means that the effect is a little bit smaller. Right? And so all that these graphs are plotting out is the predicted achievement as a function of absences on the horizontal axis. So it's downward sloping, means that achievement goes down as absences go up. These are statistically significant downward slopes, so the effect is real and it's harmful. But if you squint, or maybe you don't even have to squint too hard, the red line is a little bit flatter. So our hypothesis, and the hypothesis from Morgan's survey is right, that absences have become a tiny bit less harmful post-COVID. Okay. But not that much less harmful that we should not care about them. So the average effect is about 10% smaller, but still statistically significant, still practically significant, still something we should care about, in my subjective opinion. And then the other thing to think about is that, in a sense, even if they're a little bit less harmful now, they're more common now, and so those two things kind of offset each other in the grand scheme of things. So I think we should still worry about them, and the evidence from pre-COVID seems to hold up pretty well after COVID with regard to the harmful effects of absences. So, thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic start. We're now going to move over to Nat, who's going to talk to us about the relationship between attendance and graduation rates.
All right, thanks all. And I said at the beginning that we had 9 papers today, and 8 of them came out of Carwig. So this is using district level data that we gathered through R2L, but we thought it was appropriate in this panel. And we had papers that will be forthcoming that Sam mentioned on weather that we just couldn't quite get together in time, and also using some sports data. So I'm just sort of throwing those out there because they're going to be great. But you'll have to come back another time to get those papers. Anyway, we wanted to look at the relationship between graduation rates and chronic absenteeism over this same sort of pandemic period. We called it graduation in the time of COVID, which is very similar to that lovely novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. Just want to make sure everybody gets that. Anyway, so look, graduation rates buck the trend of what we've been seeing. During COVID, test scores, we know they plummeted. And we know that chronic absenteeism nearly doubled, and graduation rates rose. They didn't rise by much, but they did, and that's quite puzzling. Seth mentioned just earlier that, hey, previously using non-district level data, using sort of kid level data, we can see that chronic absenteeism is a risk for graduation, for high school graduation, and there's lots of research that shows that it's one of the best indicators of whether a kid's going to graduate from high school. So the puzzle here is, well, okay, chronic absenteeism went up a lot. Lots of things happened. Why didn't graduation rates? So here's a look. This is the R2L data. This is district level data. I think I'll probably say that multiple times because the unit of analysis matters. It covers over a lot of variation. You can see chronic absenteeism jump. We've seen that. Now, Sam is a very responsible sort of person when he displays things, and everything's got a 0, so it looks like there's no difference in the graduation rate. But a point change in graduation rates is kind of a big deal, and we see that the only downturn was from 2020 to 2021, and that's largely because in that 2019-2020 school year, well, we shut down school for the last quarter, so it was very difficult to not graduate. So that's a little bit of an artifact of the pandemic. And the fact of the matter is that, yeah, we see that though it technically went up in 2023, it's essentially flat, but relative to the pre-pandemic, we would expect a downturn. These are lots of dots, and you can see that the green dots are pre-pandemic and the reddish dots are post-pandemic. You can see in sort of the cloud of dots that it's greener on the bottom and it's redder on the top. And that sort of fits the patterns that we're seeing. What you should see is the 2018 and 19 in the, what is that, teal and dark green. They have a steeper slope. And we have a lessened slope by a pretty good margin in 21, 22, and 23. That just means at least in sort of the basic relationship got weaker. So we wanted to model this, excuse me, based on chronic absenteeism in particular. Again, because of the historical relationship the two have had, we allow the relationship to vary over time, and we capture it with some interaction terms. We include demographic controls and changes in graduation requirements. That's an important thing. States said during the pandemic, all right, well, we're going to suspend this requirement, or we're going to, you don't have to pass this test, or whatever the changes were. We did our best to gather those at the state level, not at the district level. And we have data for 22 states. So we have millions of kids. Well, I don't know about millions of kids. We have lots of kids, 22 states of graduates over this period. And look, what we did in this chart is the red is the observed graduation rates for our 22 states. And the green is not observed. It's what we would predict. And basically what we did was we took the 2018-19 data and we modeled, okay, well, what's that relationship? And then making that relationship constant over the period after the dotted line, but using the increase in chronic absenteeism. In other words, we forced the prediction to use the old relationship in chronic absenteeism, and the predictions, if chronic absenteeism still mattered like it used to during the pandemic, were some pretty large differences. Now, let me point out a couple of things on here. The first is the axis is small. You can only see 5 points on the graduation rate on the whole axis. So let's not get too out of sorts here. And then the only one that is significant at the 0.05 level here is the 2022 gap, which is a little over 3 points. I will also say that this is our most conservative take. There's other models we could have done to sort of, game it and make it look bigger. And it's no longer significant in 2023. A little bit more on that in a moment. Look, if this relationship had not weakened in 2020, then we would have expected the national graduation rate, or at least based on these 22 states, if they held sway, to have been about 3 points lower than it would. 3 points on a graduation rate, it's a lot. It's about 100,000 students. That if chronic absenteeism, the relationship it held, might not have graduated. That's more than all the 12th graders in New Jersey. So it's not a small number of students. It's worse, and I'll show these in just a moment, in high poverty districts. So this is if you think about the students who didn't graduate, about 1 in 5 might not have graduated. So we see this difference between the high and low poverty. The high poverty is in red, and again, the predicted is the lower version, and the low poverty is up high. So I said, well, in 2022, we had that 3-point differential overall. Well, it's about a point in low poverty districts, and this is about half the districts in these 22 states. And for the high poverty districts, it's about 4 points. So it's much larger effect. In other words, the relationship weakened more and had a greater effect in high poverty districts. It didn't make it on here. I just wanted to say we have this in the paper and you could see it. We did use some school data in 3 states. These are large states, New York, Ohio, and another large state that escapes me currently. But when we use the state and the school level data, partially a little bit because we have school level data, partially because we just have these 3 but very large states. The differences are large. They're in 3 years, and they're at the 5 and 6 point range. So in some states, this is much more evident than others. So what could explain this? 2 possibilities. It may be that who is chronically absent may be different now. It could be that, well, there's more kids that are chronically absent now than there were before. And because of that, it might have just sort of climbed up the distribution into students who've actually mastered their content, and the graduation is fine. So it could just be that there's more high-achieving students that are now chronically absent, so that doesn't matter. It could also be that during the pandemic, folks running districts that made sort of emergency changes didn't pivot back. And thus some of the changes that were made during the pandemic on an emergency footing, which again, I think had lots of reasons for, ended up sort of lowering rigor, maybe inflating grades, allowing the makeups to be easier, expanding credit recovery, which we definitely saw. In other words, they made it easier to graduate. and that is trailing forward. You may suspect that, at least in my subjective perspectives, I think that we have a little bit of the who is chronically absent, and we have more of education leaders changes. I think the question about which of these is true is whether it was by design. I don't think that there's large thoughts about people thinking in 2022, we should re-engineer the relationship between chronic absenteeism or attendance and graduation. I think that's a hard thing to argue. And then there's another one about whether it's good for students. And my druthers also, we don't have evidence on this, but I think that this weakened relationship is probably not good for students. And so we think the answer to both these questions are no, and we think it's important that we reset these expectations deliberately now, sort of take a pivot off of some of the changes during the pandemic to sort of right this relationship. And I'll leave it to you.
And finally, we're going to close with Ethan, who will be presenting findings on the role of absenteeism in learning loss and recovery.
Great. Thanks again to Nat and his team for putting all this together. It's really impressive to see so many attendance researchers take up the call to do this, and I'm very impressed that everyone got their work done, mostly to spec on time. So good job, everybody. I realize I'm the last speaker, and between you and your weekend, so Seth has already done all the hard work. My paper is going to piggyback, or my presentation is going to piggyback on some of the work that Seth did. We are looking at this question of everyone's familiar with this notion of learning loss. We're familiar with this idea that chronic absence has increased, and we're actually going to ask the question, how much of the learning loss that we see can be attributed to the fact that students are missing more school? So you'll recall hopefully the findings from about 20 minutes ago, this chart where Seth was showing us that we see chronic absences are worth about 10% of a standard deviation in terms of the harm that they do to student test scores. This is smaller than COVID, but still significant and still a factor in our schools. And we also see on the right that the rates of chronic absence have gone up. This is data from North Carolina. We were hoping to use data as well from Maryland, and we're still hoping we can work that out. Maryland unfortunately changed its test in between the pre and post COVID, so we're still working out trying to get that data ready for presentation. But we know that the old relationship still holds. Chronic absence harms student test scores, and our rates are going up. Just to give you a little sense of the scale that we're dealing with here. So as Seth said, we're dealing with a standard test score scale here, and in the scale, a standard deviation is about 10 points. So you can see between 2019 and 2021, we lost about 5 points. So about a half of a standard deviation in terms of the total learning loss that we saw at the peak of North Carolina's data. And you can also see that we've had some learning recovery since then. So we have seen test scores improve, and I'll show you, we'll break it out in a little bit later by student demographics, but you can see that that we're on the rise, and we're closing that gap of that original learning loss. Key though, and this is maybe a hint to what's to come, is though we've experienced quite a bit of learning recovery, our rates of chronic absenteeism have remained very high even post-pandemic. So we're seeing a little bit of an unhooking between the rates of chronic absence and what we're seeing with our test score data. And I should have said, these are the data we ran in both math and reading, and it's very similar. So we're just going to show you math scores to keep it nice and simple on a Friday afternoon. So the basic question that we asked was, what role does absenteeism play in learning loss and recovery following COVID? And basically, we're going to lead you through like kind of a thought experiment of what would happen if we basically put our chronic absenteeism rate in North Carolina back to where it was pre-pandemic. So as a lot of the researchers in the room who have studied attendance for a long time know, chronic absenteeism has been a problem for a long time. What the pandemic did was to make it a bigger problem in more places, more of the time, but it's been an issue for a long time. So we're not gonna go too pie in the sky. We're just gonna say what would happen if we put it back to where it was pre-pandemic. What would happen in terms of what would we expect in terms of our learning recovery. Does this vary across socio-demographic groups? And again, we're going to focus on 5th grade math. It's very similar when we used other grades, and it's also similar when we used reading scores, but we thought we would keep it simple. Okay. So the thought experiment that we did, as I mentioned, we're going to in North Carolina, we have chronic absence rates increased by 9 percentage points, so from 8% to about 17%. And if you think about what this means in practical terms, and I think it's really useful, I was really glad to see that on that slide, useful to bring it into how many students are we really talking about here? What is the change that we're really dealing with? That would change the status of roughly in 5th grade in North Carolina in our data. You would basically be changing the chronic absent status of 6,500 students or so. And if we think about what that would mean in terms of, based on Seth's estimation, our prior estimation of, okay, what's the effect of chronic absence on scores post-pandemic? You're talking about basically adding about 1 point to their test score scale. So if you do the math there, you're talking about increasing the average test score rate by about 6,500 points. If you do the math, you're talking about increasing the average rate, the average score in North Carolina, by about 0.09 points. So that's just the basic math. And so what does that mean in terms of what we're talking about if we think about that 0.09 in terms of how much learning has been lost? You can see this is our chart again. So if you think about that in terms of if we rolled the attendance rate back, we're still dealing with, in 2023, the average was still about 1.2 points below where it was pre-pandemic. So if you add back the 0.09 that we just calculated by moving students from being chronically absent to not, you would be explaining about 7.5% of our learning loss from that exercise. We realize that this is crude, but we thought this was a useful, just sort of back of the envelope way to build an intuition about how much are we really talking about if we were able to get it back to where it was pre-pandemic. If you look at this by student groups, as we all know and we've seen from other papers, obviously different groups experienced different increases in chronic absence. Rates approximately doubled from their baselines of about 12% and 14% for Black students and socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So you can see that there are both the rates of a learning loss and learning recovery differed. And on the next slide, I have the specific numbers we calculated for those groups. So basically what we're talking about at the end of the day, after our kind of rough estimation, that we still have a learning loss, so that we've experienced in North Carolina quite a bit of learning recovery. We're still talking about 1 or 1.5 points lower than we were pre-pandemic. And our causal estimates, and again, we want to stress that these are causal estimates, and if you don't like our estimates, direct your questions to Seth. He will answer all your questions. They suggest that we can explain, and I was about to say only, but again, it depends how you think about this. It's about 7.5% of the learning loss we think can be attributed to just the increases in chronic absence rates. It's a little bit higher for Black students, about 9.2%, and about the same for socioeconomically disadvantaged students, about 9.2%. So I think the sort of the takeaway message here is it's not that it's not affecting the learning loss levels. Like, definitely the increase in chronic absence clearly is, but if you were hoping that, oh, well, we just need to go back to getting the students in school back to where they were pre-pandemic, that won't get us there in terms of what we're talking about learning loss. I also want to stress at this point that I think it's useful to think about test scores, but that this is only one dimension on which we can think about the harm done to students when they're not in school. So we like to go to test scores. For the last 2 decades, we've always been thinking about test scores, but I really want to stress that this is only one dimension. And if we think further out about other things we were going to want to do and follow up, it would be interesting to do other outcomes about the relationship between being chronically absent and other things that happen at school, whether it's sense of belonging or well-being or all those adult relationships. Those can also be affected. So, don't be... it is both easier to make up work if you're absent, but there may be other harms that we want to think about and grapple with. So with that, we'll get to the Q&A, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move to panel discussion now, but we will have time for audience questions at the end. Ethan has actually just stolen my first question, so I'll dive into the second one. So my sort of basic interpretation of what we've looked at today is that all presentations seem to show a slight decoupling of attendance and student outcomes, thinking about academic outcomes. So do you think this is a sign of increased flexibility and responsiveness in education, or should we be taking it as a warning sign around standards? I'm going to go for Seth first.
Well, I'm writing a book about grade inflation this summer, so I think that changing standards and is certainly part of it. I also think that kind of what I alluded to with like the losses beget losses and coordination problems, and there's just other stuff going on that affects test scores, and there always has been. And I mean, we've literally seen that the effect of absences is what it is, and the picture Ethan shows that the learning loss and the chronic absent graphs are moving in opposite directions. So there's different different things are happening.
And Nat?
Well, I'm a little bit stumped on the answer, actually. I mean, I would like to say that it was more mechanical because, look, I mean, I think that being in school is important, and I'm a little bit struck by, I was talking with Sam yesterday, thinking, man, I thought that the percentage of learning loss would be higher, but I did think that the decrease that Seth showed would be right in that range. So I do think that there's something of a decoupling, and I think it's a little bit both hand. I don't think, and I'll sort of ape or mirror Seth's comment that I think that there's a lot in the mix, and that we're still sort of in the rotor wash of the pandemic. But I also am a big believer that we need to sort of settle those things into a little bit more systematically related and controlled and led phenomenon. So I'm looking for leadership out of this, even if the systems aren't sort of locked down now.
Yeah, of course.
I should have said the point about like social norms changing, I think, is really important. And I teach a lot of like MPP master students down the road. Similar story. Absences have gone up, and I think the faculty and the students sort of care less about them in a sense when they are somewhat valid, because they know that the missed work is going to get made up. And so I think part of what's happening is that there are parents and students who are being absent or allowing absences now that didn't allow them pre-COVID, precisely because they know that the work will get made up one way or another. And they've seen how Zoom can work. They've seen how the apps can work. And those aren't the kids that we're worried about now or then. And I think one of the real challenges on the research and data side is to separate out the harmful absences from the less harmful absences. And there's no sort of magic data that says, which kids are which in that sense, so.
And I would just add, I want to co-sign both the Nat's idea that we need leadership, and that there's a choice that we can accept the idea that they are decoupling or we cannot. I mean, we can say that the incentives are wrong here and that it's not enough that that the grades are mostly, or the test scores are mostly back. If we think that it's important, and I certainly do, that students are in school, then we need to recalibrate those, both the expectations that we set. I know it will make the families in Morgan's survey unhappy, but we don't have to make it quite so easy to make up the work, and we can also put a marker down that there are other things that we do in school and that matter, that you're in the building for, than just either your grades that might be inflated or your test scores at the end of the year. So I think that's something. It's a policy question, it's a leadership question, and the empirical data is what it is, but it's a judgment call about how we want to manage that reset. And one more thing. We were looking, Morgan and I was saying, I do think that we really need to hold tight to this cultural thesis, because Morgan pulled up his data that he showed, but we didn't spot it fast enough. But we're seeing that kindergartners, so kids who were not in school during the pandemic, so there's no plausible explanation that they're, I was thinking, well, they're ninth graders, and if your high school got disrupted, then of course you don't feel connected to your high school, and you might feel, but when you're talking about kindergartners having higher rates of absences than prior kindergartners, that to me, and this is something, again, it's hypothesis, it's empirical, we could look if they have siblings who are already in school, but that to me says that there's something cultural happening, that parents, to Seth's point, have decided that it doesn't matter, or there's been a shift in the threshold for holding students back, at home, and that we need to really grapple with the ramifications of that.
I just want to give one more totally subjective argument here that I fully believe in. And that is that schools are good. Going to school consistently is good. And so we can marshal evidence, and we should. And we should also argue that consistent attendance to coherent institutions is what I'm willing to fight for. So I'll go down with that ship.
I think we're all going down with you. I know hindsight is a wonderful thing, and we don't have a time machine, but I just want to take us back to February 2020. I'm a public health person. I was involved in making policy decisions. Let's go back to February 2020. What would you want me to know then, from everything you've learned over the last 5 years, that maybe we didn't know at the time, to help inform the kind of decision making at the time? Big question, sorry.
Well, I guess one thing, is the level of inequity in access to the catch-up tools that we've all talked about, making catch-up easier, whether it's as basic as broadband access, or computers or apps or places at home to do that sort of schoolwork, and absolutely, like, that sense that not everyone has the same place to go study at home was known, but I think that the pandemic and the ramifications and learning those after really highlighted the degree of that inequality.
Yeah, I think that we've talked in some of the previous sessions, what are the causes behind this? And some of it is disengagement. And I really think that is a key factor. And that disengagement, as Seth was saying, losses beget losses. I think disengagement actually begets disengagement. So it makes it very difficult to sort of clamber out of that hole. I think that many of the decisions that we made, many people made out of the best intentions as far as school closures, were not linked to sort of the universal. We can't necessarily link them to the absolute outcomes that we've seen, and I don't think that we should. I do, however, think that for some of our most disengaged students, we set options for, or we just set the conditions for that disengagement to flower. I think we're seeing it bloom.
Ethan, anything to add?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Okay. So actually, Ethan, I'm going to come back to you and your work, which showed absences explain a non-trivial but modest share of post-COVID learning loss. And we know that schools and districts are grappling with a lot at the moment. In terms of the kind of policy decisions, how would you advise they are balancing investment in academic recovery versus strategies to address chronic absence?
Oh man. I mean, I would piggyback off of what Nat just said. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think of it just as an academic, tracking. I know we've been trained in the last 20 years to think in terms of the test scores, but I do think that there's been, whether you want to say a cultural break or a disengagement or just a resetting of the view of what the relationship between families, communities, and schools is, whether you want to frame that as a violation of trust because schools reopen too slowly or something else. But I think that the disengagement or this idea that it doesn't matter if you're in, it's okay, it's fine, you'll catch up, that we need to address that piece. And that when we engage, and there are, I mean, I think it's worth saying, and it's important to say, and Jacob mentioned this, and I think Kevin did too, that there are plenty of bright spots out there. There are plenty of examples of districts that have recovered their learning loss, that are continuing to do good work, that are not seeing these large chronic absence problems or not the scale. And so I think the focus should be around engaging families, engaging students, and I tend to think the other stuff will follow. And I would not advise chasing the learning loss piece. That to me is missing a little bit of the problem, especially in a world where, and I suspect we will find it as more people do studies, that good students, moderately good students, I mean, Jacob's data seems to suggest this, that a lot of students who used to miss no school, they miss a couple days now. And that's just become a norm. And I don't think it's worth chasing those test score points. I think we should focus on the bigger issue that families seem to have disengaged, and we see disenrollment, other options. And I think we should think about that problem more than just the learning loss problem or learning recovery.
Great, thanks. We're going to move to audience questions now. I can see one in the middle here.
Hi, thank you all for sharing your research. It's been really interesting to hear. Kind of piggybacking on of what Ethan just said, I'm curious how you envision addressing a cultural shift in attitudes about attendance, like from the perspective of school leaders or teachers or even parents. How do we adapt to the new technology that does exist and the reasons that students can be more casual about missing schools while encouraging them that in-person attendance is important and required?
I'm going to steal the answer that Seth, I'm sure we get. I have written a lot about the history of grading and testing, and students and families are extremely good at calibrating to incentives. And I think we've just gotten we've fallen out of balance, I think partly because we've lowered standards, we've allowed this sort of unhooking. And I don't have a pat answer for you, but I do think that we can set policy to say, okay, you can't graduate if you're chronically absent. I mean, that's maybe not the answer, but I do think that it's there are messages, and if there's something we know about how students behave is that they take up the messages that are embedded in our policies, whether those are grading policies or attendance policies. And so I would think hard about what our policies are communicating, because I do think that people respond to that. People still care about school. They still want their students to do well, and it may be that we've just fallen out of balance in how we do that.
Another question in the middle here.
Most of the data, or all of the data presented today, appears to be on public education. Do you have any data on charter schools or private schools? And are you seeing same trends?
Charter schools were in our data, but we did not separate them out specifically. So I can't answer that exactly with our data.
Yes. So not in the data that we use. I will say for the collection for the return to learn data, which is somewhat separate from this, there are a couple of places where you have private school attendance and chronic absenteeism data. On the attendance data, we have it for Indiana. In Indiana, we've seen similar increases during the pandemic, but a faster recalibration to get closer to and actually close, in some cases, the pre-pandemic norms. Charters despite the 4-4 split at the court, are public schools. So I'm going to still sort of count those in, and they're included in the public numbers with the return to learn data.
Nat, I'm curious about whether with the graduation rate pieces, like if we're seeing any differences in workforce participation, post-secondary enrollment, right? If we might think that if you were trying to answer the question, does it matter if we've maybe cheapened high school diplomas? And so, do we have more disengaged young adults post high school? Is that something you're trying to think about?
It is something I'm thinking about. I haven't been able to measure it. Anecdotally, I'm sort of hearing about the disengagement across the board. You asked Seth about his MPP students, and I'm not asking to out you publicly, but I hear from a lot of folks in the BA world and the grad school world that are saying we're definitely seeing it as well. And to some degree, to echo what Ethan said, we do have the power to dictate the products that we offer as schools. We can go down the road to making them more and more technology based, and we did that in a forced fashion during COVID. I do think that sort of pushing back on that is not just a choice that we can have. I mean, I'm going to argue that schools will be better for it, and that we can do engagement. I do think some people will dislike the lack of convenience, that it's more convenient. But we sacrifice a lot on the altar of convenience. So.
And for the record, AU is the best school of public affairs in DC, and US News will back me up on that. I should have said also, when I talk about this work, and even years ago when I talked about this work outside of education audiences, like broader labor market, labor economist groups, where I said, why care about absences? On some level, employers value regular attendance. And this is a lifelong skill. It's a lifelong habit. It's highly correlated with all sorts of psychological traits that are generally good things. It's a proxy for a non-cognitive skill or social skill or soft skill, whatever you want to call it. And so, again, sort of forget the test scores. Think about, is there loss of whatever this nebulous social skill is? Is there loss of this sort of stick-to-itiveness or whatever? And I think probably, talking with people that, own businesses and hire people, they're having trouble hiring people, right? And they're having trouble hiring people that show up regularly for work and stuff. And so just to double down on the idea that there's much more to test scores here, this is a valuable personality trait related, and it's part of a habit that gets formed early in school, and we've definitely lost some of that, and hopefully we can bring it back.
I think we've got time for one last question here at the back.
I still want to circle back on the idea of decoupling of absenteeism and schooling. Because I feel there might be some ways to more rigorously show why you might see reduced effects of absences on test scores post-pandemic. One is we have to consider those effects on a broader context where actually you see a lot more intense interventions happening in school or out of school, right? So like high impact tutoring is one of those examples. And you might want to see whether there are districts or schools that are heavily using high impact tutoring versus those schools that are not using that, to see whether there are differential effects of absences. Another idea might be high impact tutoring are mainly targeting those low achieving kids. So maybe the reduced effects might be driven by those low achievers because they are more likely to receive interventions. So I just feel like that kind of reduced effects is really interesting, and there are ways to further dig into that.
Does anyone want to respond?
Fully agree. And the high impact tutoring is a great example of a response. And I was thinking like a general equilibrium response. Like the whole world changed in all sorts of ways over and above absences. Test scores went down. funds were used for the high impact tutoring, that's a great example of sort of this, it's easier to catch up because there's this resource here to help catch up that didn't used to be there.
Okay, I think we'll let that be the final word. Huge thank you to all our panelists, and we're going to hand back to Nat for closing remarks.
All right, so some closing remarks. It's 5:20 on a Friday. I should wrap these up in about 45 minutes. So I actually want to just do this briefly. The first one is, my first comment is no smoking gun. I was promised a smoking gun, a monocausal explanation, a simple lever to pull. I don't think that we had that, so I'm sorry to disappoint anybody who was coming for Mr. Plum in the kitchen with the candlestick. I do think that we've seen some consistency and some things that we can learn on the fact that we've seen some pre-COVID trends that are really kind of coming back into form in a number of these things that we've seen, particularly in the last couple of years, on a lot of the trend data. We saw that in sort of the reasons. We saw that in the effects. We've seen that in a number of ways in the patterns. I do think that there's a couple of things that we should just make very clear. Morgan said, well, Nat wanted to look at the percentage point change, which indeed I do think is true. We see sort of this rising tide, but I think that it's incumbent on us to say that chronic absenteeism still affects disadvantaged students more, and they're bearing the tolls more. So that even though we have seen this broad rise and sort of broad fall in some even respects, I do think that it's fundamental to think that the toll is falling on them. I think that there's a couple of places where it's worth noting that we've seen some things that I think we can kind of put down. I really appreciate Arya's work on the teacher absences, because I have heard from I've heard lots of pet theories over the past few years, and one of them is, well, you should see the teacher absences. And while teacher absences are up, I'm also going to venture that, insurance salesmen's absences may also be up, but that's probably not causing student absenteeism. And so the fact that we've at least gotten some sort of clarity on that point, I think is really something that we can do. And I think that there's also some at least circumstantial evidence about the sickness, which folks were arguing with me a lot last year. No, it's just sickness, it's long COVID, it's RSV, and so forth. And I think that what we've seen a lot in some of those patterns is, yes, sickness was very real during the pandemic, but it's probably not still the case. And I think that there's some things that we've seen about targeting and predictions that it's useful, it's possible, and that we can take that data forward. A couple of things on what's next. For the Carwood group, we're going to actually meet a little bit later if we have any energy left and talk about sort of what's next, both on landing these papers and whether there are more extensions to work on. So I'd encourage you to stay tuned for that, and for the authors in the room, buckle up. There's more work that I think that we can be done. And the one last thing that I want to push on for folks in the room, but also those listening, is chronic absenteeism may not be where it's at. So we have seen repeatedly over time that chronic absenteeism was put as the major measure of absenteeism. It's certainly shot up. I've been sort of banging my fist on the table for some time. But attendance appears to have gone up sort of across the board. And every day of attendance seems to matter for student outcomes. So I think it's just important that we note that while we bill, chronic absenteeism gets top billing, I think we still have an attendance problem that we still need to work on. And it's important for us to maybe turn the attention more broadly, not just on chronic absenteeism, but on attendance generally. I want to just give some thanks. Again, I want to thank AEI for sort of putting up the effort on this, and my colleagues, Sam, Chris, have been incredibly, Sam Holland and Christopher Robinson have been just incredibly helpful on all these things. And I want to thank Arnold for sort of funding these things. And I want to thank all of you watching sort of online on C-SPAN, and the folks who sat through 3 hours or so. I will say that post-pandemic, I do have a little bit of evidence here from AEI that getting attendance in a room is harder. And we have a full room here, and you stuck out for 3 hours through it. And so I appreciate that. And I want to thank you all and let you off to your weekend. So thanks very much.